12 miles below. By Mark Arrows. Chapter 131 to 140. Book 3, Chapter 40, Blinded. You're 50 years too young to be questioning me of all people, you faithless brat. I'm based on a crusader of the fifth oath. Got me a lifetime of intuition, and it's all screaming at me that something's completely wrong about all of this. Cathita being dramatic. This isn't you being upset that I'm having a nice day with someone? I asked, keeping the comms channel to myself. Hecate remained to the side, hands folded while she sat. I'd asked for a moment of time while I spoke with my armor. Cathita's arguments quickly devolved into a string of curses, most of which I didn't understand, and half of them involved gold in some way. I sighed, wondering what sort of insanity I'd need to deal with this time. Need to step out for a bit, I said, waving to Hecate and tapping my helmet with a finger. Got to get some more material to work with the armor. Some things are still loose up in here and need their screws tightened. She nodded, her smile fading off slightly, but she let me know she'd be here in the meantime. With that settled, I turned and took a stroll to clear my head and talk sense to the paranoid grandma stuck in my head, who currently had every grey hair on her non-existent head sticking up. What sort of evidence do you have, besides intuition? I asked, taking steps outside the ruined church. Goddess's golden tits, you're dense. Did you not hear a single word I've been yelling at you since you put on your bucket? We listened to intuition like scripture, or we died. She said, putting a heavy emphasis on the last word. And I'm smelling a wet rat lurking around. This all reeks like danger. You can't smell anything. You're a simulacrum living digitally inside the armor. This is the hill you're going to die on? Fine. Let's start with that armor of hers. Whatever that Deathless is wearing, if she even is a Deathless at all, it's not armor. It looks like armor, glimmers like armor, shines like armor, and it's not armor. I'm hearing a lot of accusations here and still not a lot of evidence. You got something better, or are you going to teach me some more creative swear words? Around me, remains of hacked up roots littered the walls where I'd gone and pilfered previously. I took a few steps past those to find somewhere more quiet. You want a list? Fine, I'll gild it for you. Beyond the very basic minimum of her armor being dead quiet with no response to any of Journey's handshake requests, which should already be evidence enough that something's off, the physical structural setup is also incorrect. Joints don't connect correctly, plate density around vital areas isn't increased, there's no room for artificial fibers or propulsion abilities in a dozen places where there should be. Everything that lets an armor resist environmental pressure isn't there. 12 stratas, there isn't even room for a power cell in her legs, unless they fit inside her actual legs. You didn't notice this at all, you daft fool? It looks more like she made up an idea of what armor looks like and had a craftsman rush order it. Where are you going with this? By all rights, that armor shouldn't be able to move. It's all decoration, a fake. Pyrite lit up under a spotlight to fool the faithless. I paused in my steps, not quite sure I was following on her logic. You do realize that Hecate is paralyzed under her armor, right? She needs it to move. And where's your evidence on that? You're tossing that word around like it owes you money all of a sudden. Have you seen her outside her armor yet? Or are you only taking her word for it and nothing else? And how exactly am I going to ask her for proof of that? Take her armor off. I stopped to process what I'd heard for a moment. I'm not going to ask her to strip, Cathita. Did snow fill up your head or something? Another few paces down the tunnel and another idea popped into my head. Oh, suddenly all shy are we? You seemed real chummy with her just a few minutes ago. Look, there's plenty of people out there who forge fake armors either for ceremonies or as a bluff. I said, trying not to let the old bat get in my head. It's possible she's doing something like that. What Deathless is unable to afford an armor? It could be a status symbol, she's freshly minted out. Maybe this is the best she could do. Regrettably, I wasn't in a good position to have clean footage when Hecate took out the drake's throat, on account of missing my head. But you were there. How fast did she move? Go on, tell me. Very fast. Exactly. Can someone move that fast without armor? I waved a hand in dismissal. She's deathless. It's possible this is a spell of hers. Some kind of passive, like her eyesight. Can't rule that out. I heard snarling and it wasn't from me. Which is it then? Is she paralyzed or using powers? She could have simply said it's an ability of hers, but she didn't. Why? How are you going to explain that she lied to you about the paralysis if she's got a deathless spell letting her move like that? I am shocked and saddened to find out someone has secrets they want to keep secret. Little bit on brush up on humanity, Cathita, everyone's got secrets, and whatever her secrets are, they aren't deadly to me. Besides, it's possible this is a different make of armor. Cathita outright groaned. If she could run her nails down her cheek, I'd imagine she'd be doing that right about now. All armor follows the same protocols, the original schematics were dabbled with by the same forge master, and he clearly had a policy to not fix things that didn't need fixing as far as Journey's guessing. There are no models that wouldn't use the base template and handshakes, there's no reason to muck that up. What if that armor's made from a different direction by a different forge master, maybe halfway around the world? Could explain why you can't talk to her armor and the wings she's got. And talking about that, why haven't we got wings either? Seems a little unfair. The armor competition here has an entire leg over us. You're weaseling away from the point. From everything I've heard, her profile makes no sense to any Undersider or Imperial Order I can track. You made up your mind to trust her, and now you're finding all kinds of ad hoc reasoning instead of remaining skeptical, it's clear as daylight. Is it because she's got a pretty face and a rack? It is, isn't it? Journey can monitor your heartbeat. No, that's got nothing to do with it. I said, hotly. She saved my life and she's a deathless. Nothing more than that. She could be part of some Undersider separatist tribe or something. People forging off the land and living outside cities. It'd be a brutal way of life that would fit. The lack of outgoing signals could be that the armor's trying to be stealthy, could be their default way of life. Then how in the goddess's name does she know so much about everything? Which is it? Is she a feral savage or a book-cultured sheltered princess? That got an unintentional gulp from me, I had no answer to that one. Cathita pounced on the opening. You think I didn't overhear while the two of you were chatting away the time? Your heartbeat's gone up again. What's this, feeling, guilty? Look. I said, finding a place to sit down and clear the air. She saved my life. I was at my weakest for hours, and outright knocked out at the start. Couldn't protect myself from a baby with a sharp tooth even if I wanted to. If she wanted me dead, she had hundreds of chances. Instead, I'm back to full strength. Even if she's got some oddities, she's not my enemy. I'm alone down here, and here you are telling me to distrust the only friendly person I've met? You can be skeptical of her if you want, but I choose to trust her. The one thing I can think of that she might be using me for is to piss off Tuekar. Which I'm fully behind. Cathita stopped, likely about to go right back into another tangent before abruptly halting mid-word. I can see there's no point trying to convince you. Fine. I'll keep my guard up for the moment instead and yell at you when the betrayal happens. Agreed. Are we done? A pause. We're done. I said my piece. If youth wants to act all reckless just because there's some bouncing rack strutting around, then be it on your own head. Do you really need to be this crass about everything? I'm being remarkably polite, all said and done. She said, indigent. The Imperial training grounds were 100 times worse. Squires are a different breed and I had to train those louts. She did have a point about the girl in the end. No matter what kind of background I could think of for Hecate, there was always one piece that didn't fit. Whoever Hecate was, she didn't want to tell me the full truth for her own personal reasons. And that wasn't my business. But there was something that I needed to prepare for so that I wouldn't get caught by surprise again. That fight against Tuekar. How did he take control of Journey? I asked. Cathita gave a sheepish tut. Remember that string of verbal reminders all armors do? Releasing security locks is a part of that, and it means something you dolt. What prevents cyber attacks is stupid simple. If Journey itself can't move your arm, same goes for anything that's attacking through Journey. With everything locked down, the worst thing Journey can do to you is say nasty things about your face and give bogus reports to you and your little friends. That is, until you gave the master keys to Journey. Now, the enemy only needs to have a stronger cyber suite than this bucket of metal and they've got their hands on the keys you tossed over. And Tuekar can do that. Oh, what, him? A feather? One of the most powerful enemies among the machine arsenal, constantly maintained and improved on each generation? Against an 300-year-old armor with a cyber suite made right back in the 4th era and never updated since? The same era that didn't win against machines even at their peak. She scoffed, "Pay, just a complete fluke of nature that he overrode journey in mere seconds and tried to strangle you with it. Couldn't possibly happen a second time, dearie. You can go right ahead and bet your life on that without worry. All right, point taken already. But what do we do for the future? Just completely give up on one of the best offensive and defensive weapons in my arsenal. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Journey's turned off the override with the reboot, and it really doesn't want to turn those back on. Once we're back to the surface, your future is going to be drills, training, and pain. I swore under my breath. Was afraid you'd say that. Bet you were. She cackled. On the return back to the campsite inside the ruined cathedral, we got another surprise. Hecate was gone. No message left behind, nothing. My head raced, thinking through the past few moments for any reason she'd run. Did she overhear us? Comms channel was set to private. Catheta said. Maybe this is her polite way of bowing out before it gets awkward. That metal scrap shit that put a hole in my gut could overhear us under the helmet. Feathers were supposed to be mirrors to the deathless if I remember, right? Catheta scoffed. A mirror is 1-to-1. Feathers are on a different league. If they can hear 3 miles away, the best a deathless could do is hear half of a mile. I wasn't half a mile away from her, I was a few feet. Catheta stayed silent for a moment, before giving her typical verbal shrug. Guess she did overhear us and decided to scamper away. Win-win. If she'd heard us talking about doubting her story and digging into her past, maybe she really did decide now was the best time to split up. Was she that skittish about her past? She's gone after the Drake. I said, trying to convince myself. She knows it's out there looking to pick a fight, and she's never seen me in a fight before. So she'll think to do me one last favor and make sure Fido isn't there to bog me down. Despite my words, I had that sinking feeling in my gut that she'd left for good. We both had our goals completed. There's no reason to keep going together after all. I turned and sprinted for the exit. Where in the goddess's name are you even going? Catheta yelled over my footsteps. We might be able to catch her, it's only been a few minutes. Fido probably took his sweet time making sure every exit he knew about was broken down and sealed, so the only way out of here back into the plains is the same way we came in. Ground blurred under me as I raced through the caverns, jumping over obstacles and rocks, free again to expand as much energy as I needed. What would you even say to her anyhow, chasing after her like some lost puppy? Better to let her go on her own way and keep to ourselves. I get you're a suspicious paranoid old bat who thinks the world's after me, and usually you're right, but in this one case I've got my set of intuition, and it's screaming at me to make things right. So shut it, and pull up the map. Catheta made Catheta noises at that, mostly snarling and some hissing, but the map popped up in more detail on my heads-up display, along with arrow directions to backtrack my steps and highlighted footprints showing what path she took. In minutes we'd passed by the abandoned sled, still hovering where we left it. Another quarter hour and I was sprinting down the perfectly cut cube corridor to the outside plains. Empty in every direction. Fuck, where's the footprints? They had just vanished after taking a few steps into the outdoors. I spun my view around, but all around me was the empty plains of flowers and the occasional black glass pillar in the distance. I started shouting out her name, wildly. She has wings, remember? I assume they aren't for show. My yells turned to curses and that empty feeling crept into me deeper. There was something about that meeting with Hecate that felt like fate, and I'd let it slip right through my hands. Sound caught my attention above me. I twisted my head, hoping I'd been wrong, that I'd find her standing at the top of the mountainside, doing something pensive. Or sulking with a pout. Instead, I found a heavily camouflaged Fido, leaping straight down at me, violet eyes filled with glee. The stupid stubborn machine must have been waiting at the entrance here for hours, and let Hecate pass by, probably snickering to itself the whole time. Vines and leaves he had wrapped around his body snapped away effortlessly against his weight, as his clawed hands expanded out to snatch me. The surprise at a several-ton machine falling on top of my head was just enough for the scrap shit to lash out with both its massive paws, catching my fumbling attempt to jump out of the way. 2 massive claws wrapped around the armor and clenched tightly. Shit. Shit. Rat fucking shit. I started to struggle, but each of the thing's paws was as large as my torso. Its forearms were already my full size. SSSSSS. I knew you'd come out, like vermin seeking heat. Fido hissed with content. Hiding, creeping, crawling through the mud and your tunnels such filth. Fido, my good old buddy, am I happy to see you? I growled back, struggling to get out of his grip and failing completely. I stopped and went limp, glaring right back at the creature's skeletal fangs. You know, you came at the perfect fucking time. I could use a little stress toy. The machine laughed, violet eyes glowing with malice. Such a temper, little child. I'll bring you temperance soon. There was a groaning sound around the armor. Such weakness of flesh and bone. Let me crush it from you. I couldn't feel Fido actually squeezing down on me with Journey counteracting the force, but I could certainly feel my hands and arms held firmly together. It stared down into me, fascinated with the same gaze that all machines had when strangling their prey. I could see parts of the tubes under Fido's throat still dangling from where Hecate had sliced it, leaving the Drake only his claws and mouth to do any damage with. I should have guessed he'd do something like this with what he had to work with. Journey's giving me all kinds of numbers on hull integrity here, Cathita said. Your heart rate is steady though, no adrenaline spikes either. You've got a plan in that crooked head of yours, I take it. Got about 5 minutes to figure something out before your friend here actually squishes us. I don't need 5 minutes, I said, diving into the soul fractal and feeling the full suite of the occult at my palms again. You think he's got me pinned? It's the other way around. He's done me a favor, saving me from having to track him down all over again. Clan Lord Atius had shown me the true power of the mirror fractal. He'd used it as a deathless would, at first. Spinning out ghosts of himself, each wielding a lit blade. Likely had done so for centuries. But once he knew the source behind the occult, his style had changed. Everything about the ghost image was transient, immaterial. Everything except for the occult edges. The true strength behind that spell was that it also duplicated fractals. Any fractal. Like the ones inside the occult blades and the night breakers. Cathita had said it before, a mirror is one-to-one. The universe recognized fractals wherever they appeared as patterns. Microscopic or macroscopic. On metal or dust. Surrounded by air or solid. Immaterial or material. Didn't matter to reality. Ghost images were still part of existence, all the fractals mirrored in those were just as real as reality. The occult pulsed around me, and even Fido paused for a moment, those violet eyes narrowing in suspicion. SSS. What are? Fractals inscribed on the surface of Journey all lit up, being powered again. Not a moment later, 2 pale blue occult arms lifted from my trapped position and dove right into the creature's wrists, passing through as if there was nothing but air. Those ghostly arms, covered in fractals, all still powered up. Tuekar should have warned you, Fido. I never play fair. The shield fractal on my arm flared. 2 nearly invisible domes ripped into existence. They manifested exactly where I'd predicted, right on my trapped wrists and right inside Fido's wrists, where my ghost images were. There was a momentary tug of willpower as the dome shields cut through everything that had been in the way. Fido's clawed arms grew instantly slack, all the power and direction severed. I'd made the domes large enough to cut through the creature's thick wrists completely. I wasn't finished yet. The fractal of heat flared to life in both my palms. 6 mirror arms stretched out, superimposed until they split. And all 6 arms lunged directly at Fido's head. Book 3, Chapter 41, The Teacher's Legacy. Fido howled, trying to lift his head out of the stream of fire. This was working even better than I'd hoped for. My plan had been to use the fractal of heat as mostly distraction since machines were made of metal, and metal does better against heat than fleshy human enemies, but given the instant reaction from him, heat might be more dangerous to machines than I'd thought. He wasn't getting away, of course. With nothing truly holding me down, I ripped the loose claws off me and lunged forward with my true arms. Straight for that howling head of his, right through the inferno fading away. Journey's armored gauntlets grappled the Drake's artificial fangs, and the relic armor did the rest, holding its own against the machine. My grip tightened. A cold pulsed once more and another set of translucent hands snapped up, palms up, a torrent of fire leaving each. My vision went blinding yellow for a moment as both Fido and I were engulfed into the inferno. Journey auto-compensated a moment later and the visual feedback inside my helmet turned to a dimmer darkness, letting me see what was going on. Relic armor shields had flared to life, protecting me from the ambient heat. Superheated air dangerous enough even Journey had made the internal call to protect itself. Fido did not have the same luxury. The teeth were already turning black, the ceramic material cracking from the intense temperature differential passing breakpoint after breakpoint. The metal parts inside his jaw had started to turn red hot, glowing brighter and brighter. Soon they'd start to melt off if this kept going. Fido twisted his head sharply, launching me off my feet. He then slammed his head down on the rock cliffside, dragging me through it. Journey didn't even need shields for this, that sort of diffused damage wouldn't do much to the armor itself. It was enough to disrupt my concentration, however, the occult fading away. Another twist of his head flung me straight up and the damaged fangs I was holding onto finally snapped off, crumbling into pieces. I flew straight up a good few feet, twisted like a cat in midair, and landed back safely on the ground. Atias's blade was drawn out and ignited already. Fido hadn't bothered trying to see what I'd do. He'd already decided that this was a losing battle, and it was time to peace out like the upstanding machine denizen that he was. First, he tried to grapple onto the cliffside, to escape vertically. Except that his forepaws had been cleanly sliced off, leaving him with 2 stumps and his hind legs to work with. Not enough to get him up the cliff. So, he turned tail and tried to outrun me across the field. I ran after him, screaming every kind of insult I could think of. My raised blade looking to close the gap between us so I could slice him properly. Drakes normally outrun relic armors. In good shape and with a clean bill of health. Fido was very much not in that category. Running on the 2 stumps that remained of his forward limb slowed him down far too much. I chased after him like a shadow, following the path of crushed silver flowers. I caught up. His tail flicked out at the last moment, attempting to knock me out of the way, only for my sword to slice down and out the other side while I vaulted over the swing. No more tail for Fido. Shame. This was when the drake realized he was nothing more than spare scrap running around, doomed. The drake made one last desperate plan, turned, and tried to fight me off. He twisted and lunged out with an open maw, attempting to catch and crush me with those. Journey's shields were still nearly full, so that was futile even if he landed the attack. I didn't let him so much as scratch me out of pride, easily dodging past the strike and letting the old occult blade slice off the jawline as I slide under. I didn't stop there and followed through, spinning on myself to regain momentum. The blade took out the closest hind leg in the same motion as Fido's bulk passed next to me. The winter blossom technique made me too fast. Fido, bless his metallic heart, tried to roll over and flatten me as a response. That was even easier to jump over, slicing off the last exposed limb as it passes by me on his roll. Now the drake was crippled for good. He collapsed onto the ground, struggling to adapt to the sliced limbs. My boot found the top of his skull head and stomped down, driving the entire drake back into the ground. Sit! I ordered. The drake struggled, trying to lift the head until I once more flattened him into the ground. I said sit. I said, twisting my boot side to side to really rub it in. Time you got what was coming to you. SSS, this is not over. Flesh rots. Metal is eternal. Fido snarled, still able to speak without a lower jaw, all the while pinned down into the dirt and stomped down flowers. I increased pressure down on his head, watching as cracks on the ceramic armor began to spider out from my heel. He grew still. The fight had finally gone out of the monster for good, now waiting for the inevitable execution. What, that's it. I tutted, aiming my blade. Fido, I am disappointed in you. Days of hunting us down, terrorizing us at night, all your little clever plans and plots, and this is how you go out? No bang, barely a whimper even. At least go out saying something more ominous. The drake hissed at me, one violet eye glaring up. Where I fail. SSSS. Another will not. You take nothing more than a brief respite from the inevitable. Struggle is meaningless. That's a lot better. I patted the head with the tip of my greaves. Father had executed a drake before, although he only had a dagger to work with. I think punching my sword through the skull would do the job just as well, more surface area to cut through. And then I can cut off the head for good measure. I lifted the old blade up, and found myself holding it still. Fido's violet glowing eyes stared right back at me, filled with malice. What was I hesitating for? I'd already learned this lesson. Father himself had made it clear as ice. I'm trying to talk to you in a way you might understand, boy. These things, they can't be reasoned with. They simply can't. You'll only give them an easier time killing you. The sword raised higher, ready to plunge down and end the creature for good. Is it possible that he might not have been correct about that point? Hecate. And her stupid, naive fixation on possibly finding peace between machines. SSSS, your weakness shows. The Drake hissed. Crippled, unable to offer even the most basic threats to me now. If I spared it, it would fix itself and later return to possibly kill other humans in the future. Everything I know made it clear that destroying the Drake was the only real solution. If it had been Kedra or father in my shoes, they wouldn't have hesitated for even a moment. All of my knights wouldn't have offered a shred of mercy either. They were all experienced veteran soldiers. But I wasn't them. The occult blade flickered off and I sheathed it. Maybe you're right about that. I groaned, more upset at myself. Change of plan FIDO. Against my better judgment. I'm letting you live. What? Cathida croaked out. You're joking, right dearie? Tell me you're joking. The Drake simply stared at me, the closest a machine had to surprise. Then the eyes narrowed. SSS. You wish to relay a message? I shook my head. Nope. Got nothing to say to that scraphead you call a boss. I'm not letting you live for any reason that benefits me. I'm doing it for someone else who wants to believe someday there could be peace between machine and man. Heresy. The Drake said. There can be no peace. First time I ever found myself agreeing with a machine, there can't ever be any peace. Cathida growled out. I think so too, but... Well... I shrugged and took my boot off the lizard's skull head with a few careful steps back. Here we are anyway. Now go slink away to whatever hole you crawled out from. The Drake lifted itself onto those remaining stumps, glaring at me the entire time. I thought for a moment FIDO really would try to attack me again, despite how outclassed it was, but the machine surprised me. It turned and shambled off. Goddess protect us, you should have killed it. Cathida groaned. Did you turn into a silver liquor while I was sleeping? Mercy's not something you can spend on machines, is it even capable of understanding that? I don't know. I answered truthfully. It just didn't seem right. Maybe Hecate's ideals wormed their way into my head a little too much. The lizard shambled away, not at a run, but on a lopsided walk. I could change my mind anytime and finish the Drake. There wasn't anywhere FIDO could hide from me in this area. I searched the skies for her again, but nowhere I looked did I see her. My heart sunk further. She truly was gone for good. I don't know what I expected. A deep breath, in and out. Nothing I could do about this anymore. She knew where I was going, so if Hecate wanted to see me again, it would be on her terms. I shook myself out of the stupor. Which way's the Undersider City? You know we're running late for an appointment. No thanks to you, Cathida. Me, she croaked, indigent. You're the one collecting enemies like they were gold bricks for the shrine. A nav point beeped into my HUD, showing the direction. I gave my thanks, and set off in the complete opposite direction, back to the cliffside to go loot the hover sled. If I was going to have to cover a few dozen miles of flat land all alone, I wasn't going to walk if I could help it. The sled was still there when I returned to fetch it. I felt a little bad about taking it so far from where it had been initially given, but I had an Undersider City to get to and already lost a lot of time. I was on my own from here and I'd need every advantage I could get. If the Winterscar Knights had survived against Tuekar, which I'm almost positive they had, then they'd know to meet up at the city. Searching around for me outside the city would be like looking for a needle in the chicken feed. Basically impossible. But we all knew where our ultimate destination was. This far away, I didn't need to be subtle about how I got there. Riding a hover sled using the full power of my relic armor to push forward would get me places quickly. I guided the sled back to the outside, past the cube entrance, and found someone waiting on the other side. Cathida swore. Didn't think I'd see you again after you ran off. I said, ignoring the old bat, pushing the sled into the artificial sunlight and giving it a friendly set of pats. Hecate stood at the entrance, flattened silver flowers ringed around where she'd landed. Metal wings were fully unfurled from her waist, swaying slightly in the wind. The helmet hid any sign of her face, so I had no idea what was going through her mind. It felt more like I was being judged right here and now. I reached and unclasped my helmet, tossing it into the sled, mostly because Cathida clearly had a bone to pick with Hecate just existing and was all too happy to start ranting about it. Gunning for FIDO before I could get to him? That's not exactly sporting of you. I said. Or did I scare you off somehow? She remained unmoving, gaze locked onto me for a moment, before her own hand reached for her helmet and unclasped it. Under the mask was curiosity. I observed your fight with the Drake from afar. I was surprised. I picked up a few tricks on fighting over my time. I tapped my chest. That isn't what surprised me. She said. You spared the Drake's life. Why? Spared his life, sure, but FIDO's not a happy lizard after running into me. I cut off his hands, you know? And his legs. The lower jaw too. Oh, and his tail. You know, in hindsight, I'm noticing a disturbing pattern here. I frowned, hand on my chin to complete the look. She tilted her head to the side for a moment, confused. All minor damage that can be repaired at a might forge. And machines do not feel pain in any way that matters. Not from the physical shell. Her gaze locked back onto me. Why did you allow it to leave? It's what you were talking about earlier. About possibly having a peace with machines. FIDO was crippled, and he can't shoot lasers either. He's no threat anymore, unless he can somehow insult people to death. You let him go, simply for that. I nodded. We've got to start somewhere, right? If not me, then who? I got the feeling she had a lot more to say and simply didn't know where to start. Eventually, she shook her head, smiling. You moved at speeds that shouldn't be possible for relic knights. Like your sister. She said, not so subtly changing the subject. How? You've seen her fight. She knew about Kidra leading the rebellion in the city. It's very possible a deathless like her was on the forefront. Fighting side by side with Kidra during that doomed war. Why hadn't she told me this before? Instead, she'd only mentioned it in passing, as if Kidra was someone she'd heard of rather than an ally. The more I learn about Hecate, the more things make little sense. Maybe she hadn't taken part in the Undersider War at all because of her pacifism? I have seen her in action. Hecate said, on topic. She's very skilled, and very fast. Her bodyguards also move as fast, though lack the skill she has. I hadn't expected you to follow in her footsteps like so. If you all share the same trait, it must be something that can be taught. Were you behind this? And what makes you think little old me is the one behind something like that? I asked, crossing my arms. Kidra's escorts all moving at her speed meant Kidra had shared the Winter Blossom technique with them. Things must have been extremely dire for Kidra to share that with Anka and her goons of all people. Not good, but that was to deal with later. I know who you are. Hecate said. I don't know how you've done it, however I am certain the root of this skill comes from you. She said that with such a straight face. I started thinking she meant more. That she knew me before she'd caught me falling from that cliff. But that couldn't be possible. More the matter, I was genuinely unsure if I should tell her about the Winter Blossom technique. A part of me wanted to trust her, except I didn't know if that part of me was logical or acting on emotion. Cathida's skepticism had really rattled me and all these piling uncertainties were growing now that I was aware of them. Deathless were heroes, paragons of the gods. No one assumed they could be evil. There isn't a single story about an evil deathless. It would be like questioning if the gods secretly had bad intentions for humanity. Except Psuya had tried to outright kill me for the greater good once. So there is a precedence for being skeptical here. And Hecate wasn't just a deathless, she was the latest generation of deathless. The one generation that were rumored to not be all good. But she'd saved my life. She wasn't trying to get the information from me to gain from it, she already could move just as fast with her own technique. And I owed her a life debt. Whoever Hecate was, she at least has earned some answers from me. It's called the Winter Blossom technique. I said, blowing past my common sense before I could second-guess myself more. I invented it. Kidra gave it a name and perfected it. Hecate gave a soft smile that turned into a snicker within seconds. I knew it. I had no evidence, little data, and yet I knew you would be the one behind it. I can't tell you how it works, but I can tell you it isn't usable by deathless. I said, getting ahead of her before she started asking more questions. There's a part of it you're incompatible with. But, you do already move just as fast with your own technique. Hecate continued to laugh, alternating from smaller hiccups to just smiling before breaking out into giggles again. Eventually she settled down, took a breath and asked the oddest question. If we both can move as quickly as the other, then maybe our differences in power are more equal than I thought. Would you agree to a duel? That's a little out of nowhere, what's the prompt? Did I look at you funny or are you shaking me down for my ration bars? She bit her lip, looking up, as if thinking of how to answer. Nothing of that sort. I fought against someone very much like you in the past. I lost. A part of me has always wanted a fair rematch, win or lose, if only to put it all behind me. A form of closure to my old history. You want me to be a stand-in for this guy? Yes. Rather, you are the only one who could. I thought about that for a moment. If I was reading this right, either she no longer has any means of connecting with this guy, or he was dead and I was the closest person like him. Likely the second. Before I could ask more questions, she continued. If you agree to the duel, I'll carry you to the Undersider city personally. With my wings and speed, you can arrive within a day. It will be far faster than any other method of travel. Win or lose? She nodded. Welp, free cell in the snow here, no reason not to take her up on that. I drew out my sword, giving it an experimental twirl. Shields to 50 sound good. She smiled, drawing out her own pair of swords. One more condition. I want you to fight with everything at your disposal, in any manner you can bring it out. That includes the fractals on your armor and the powers you've used against the Drake earlier. Or powers you've kept in reserve. Should I win, I need to know it was a genuine victory with no holds held. My hand froze halfway into the sled, reaching for my helmet. Gods above. Hecate knew about fractals. My first thought was that she's a deathless. Of course she'll be using the occult. Except Lord Atius was a deathless, and he hadn't known about fractals. Neither had his compatriots and expedition partners. The only people who knew were the warlocks. How do you know about that? I asked. You have repeated fractals inscribed across all plates of your armor. I thought the conclusion was obvious. What I do not know how you discovered this field. It is highly guarded. She's part of the warlock guilds? Afraid I'll have to take that one to the grave with me, that subject's not exactly light. Hecate nodded, clearly unbothered by that. Deathless, latest generation. Stronger than Atius, pulling acrobatic moves that even Kedra would have issues with. A walking library, yet outright feral in some mannerisms. A strange armor. Possibly paralyzed under it, but also moving the armor herself at the same speeds as the Winter Blossom technique. Wings. Ties with the warlocks and fractals. Extreme vision and senses. The ability to heal any life-threatening wounds. Might have outright mind-controlled Fido and ordered him away, at the cost of being spotted by Tuekar, which meant some kind of power that let her hack machines. And talking about that feather, enemies with Tuekar but still looking to have peace between humanity and machine. Not quite Imperial, not quite Undersider, and possibly not quite Warlock either given the pattern here. What sort of existence had all these things put together all at the same time? So much of it felt outright contradictory. One thing was certain, Hecate was some kind of mythic figure. Part of some might prophecy, chosen by them on a quest. That she was good at everything seemed on brand. This had turned into some kind of puzzle where the more details got added, the more everything seemed connected and yet completely disconnected. And I couldn't ask her directly about any of it. She was too skittish about her past. I could see her taking off for good just to avoid answering any of these. In a way she almost had. My hands unfroze, dragging Journey's helmet up close and equipping it again. I took a breath and put those thoughts aside. The duel came first. The helmet pressurized and Catheda came out swinging like an angry feral dog let loose out of her cage. Good job, way to let your head do the thinking. She snarked. Feel like leaking some imperial secrets next? Or are you waiting for her to give you a wink and blow you a kiss? It was almost immediately clear to me Hecate could overhear Catheda. The Deathless looked, extremely lost and swiftly growing flustered. She can hear you, Catheda. I said, calmly. Oh she can she? The old bat said with poorly hidden glee. Perfect. I have a few choice words I've been meaning to set right with that dolled up trollop. A few well-worded threats about the mute button got her to stop talking, but not before leaving poor Hecate beet red and looking anywhere other than in my direction. Catheda was extremely efficient with the few words she managed to throw out before I gagged her, managing to string together an entire paragraph of insults in as little as a half sentence. Had it been any other situation, I'd have been genuinely impressed at the creativity. She clearly had opinions and would stop at nothing to say them. Your armor's language module is very unique. Cathita, you called her? Hecata said in the awkward silence that followed, eyes constantly darting between myself and the cliff behind me, as if she couldn't keep eye contact out of embarrassment. I did not expect armor to generate more complex personalities like this. It's not the armor itself. I think Journey genuinely doesn't care about anything so long as my heart is still beating. Cathit is something else, I said, and stopped when I heard the old crusader start to growl in my ear. You know what? I'll tell you another time over a stiff drink, or 10. My armor seems to get more and more upset with you the longer I stick around. She's not exactly nice to other people and her first impression of you wasn't great. I apologize if my appearance is distracting. Hecata said, sounding supremely nervous. I had not thought about that aspect of people. It felt outright surreal to have someone apologize for how they looked of all things. When things settle, I'm going to need to strangle that crusty old bat. Again. For now, I bottled up my second-hand anger and decided to do some damage control. It's not a bother, Hecate, Cathit is just raking me over the coals for fun. I should probably clarify, when I said she's not exactly nice to other people, I mean she's not nice to anyone. Servants, knights, squires and apparently even deathless are all equally on her shit list. Truly there is nothing she holds sacred. Cathita scoffed loudly, but kept quiet otherwise, clearly aware of my earlier threats and agreeing to keep the silence so long as I wasn't misbehaving, a small mercy. I gave a traditional salute with my sword and took a standard stance, causing Hecata to instantly snap back into focus. Good way to clean up the air. There was a duel to go through. I'd use some of my occult spells, but keep the rest of my skill under wraps. As much as I disliked admitting it, Cathita was right, I'd been leaking too much for sentimental reasons. Surprise was one of my bigger advantages, better that I reserve the big hitters for when it really mattered rather than a skill-based duel. We'd have a traditional spar, I'll go all out with the best of my sword skills and then we'd be off to the Undersider city. Hecata didn't need to know everything I had in store. The Deathless smiled and took her stance. My blood froze over at the sight. I recognized it. Recognized the way her swords flourished into stance. That was no Undersider posture, nor an imperial one. It was from the surface clans, the same one Father had used time and time again when facing an enemy of unknown skill. A defensive variation, waiting for the opponent to take the first strike. She modified it to fit both her wings, stature, and dual swords. But at the core still had the ghost of his style. There were too many unique flares to it, beyond what the standard instructions for those movements were. It was him. Who taught you this? I asked, voice coming out more of a whisper. A mentor of sorts. She said. A surface knight I met. I swallowed hard, mind flashing through reasons. Father had lived an entire lifetime before I was even born, years spent underground. He must have met people. Must have had a team. Friends even. So much about him I wouldn't have known. 3 reasons surfaced. Father could have learned from someone underground, and that very same person taught Hecate. Or sometime in the past, their paths had crossed by each other and Father had trained her personally. The last option, we were hundreds of miles in the wrong direction from the final place I'd seen him. The bunker, sunken down and hiding among the Might ruins, if it still looked anything like a bunker after the machines got to it. Could Hecate really have stumbled on the bunker? By chance? Unlikely. I don't think the first option was likely either. Father would have told me at some point in the years we'd trained if he'd learned from someone else. Other than sparring with Atius, he hadn't mentioned any other mentor. This had be the second option. We were around the general area of the Undersider city, the same city that often has trade and connections with us. Father would have traveled down here many times before. He could have really met Hecate in her past, before she became a Deathless. A mentor, I muttered, mulling it over. I wasn't fighting just Hecate, I realized. I was fighting a fellow disciple. Both of us trained by the same teacher. We were Father's legacy. However this ended, I think I understood Hecate's desire. A rematch against an opponent she could no longer fight ever again, with me being the closest she could come to him. Win or lose. I knew who she was talking about. It was the same for me too, wasn't it? An opponent I could no longer prove myself against ever again. I knew it in my heart for a while now, right from the moment I had dug my hands into the family armor. Expecting the bunker to be intact in any shape was a pipe dream, not with the amount of machines that had been crawling around. I'd still go search for the ruins once the slavers were dealt with, if only to find closure myself. But I knew what I would find. My stance shifted, away from the traditions of the surface clans, crouching lower, one foot sliding back, sword held still. Inside my helmet controls, I toggled the mute button before Cathita could even squawk. I changed my mind. I was going to go all out, even if it meant using everything I had. This was a fight I wanted to win. Had to win. I do not recognize this stance. Hecata said, head tilting slightly. That's because this is my technique. I said. Rockerai, the lighting style. My head rose to stare her in the eye. I'm more than I look. Don't underestimate me, Hecate. She flinched for a moment and then smiled, weapons ready. I know. I've learned. I have my own ways to remind myself. I took one more deep breath and fully stepped into the soul fractal, the colorful world fading away, replaced by my occult sight. Tendrils spread out back into my mind, perfectly forming the roots of the winter blossom technique. More tendrils went further, reaching for all the different fractals within my armor. Occult pulsed around, the shield fractals inscribed all over my armor lit up dim blue, now being powered. Inside my armor, every other inscribed fractal was being awakened. I'd trained and drilled this until the entire process took hardly a second with little thought. A far cry from the first time I'd had to use it in a duel, against Shadow Song. Senses stretched out from me in a pulse. The concept of a relic armor appeared first along with all the dozens of fractals shining within it. Concepts of the ground under us came after as the pulse raced out. Life, plants, flowers, insects. My awareness bloomed outwards, speeding out. And when my sight reached Hecate, I was utterly unprepared for what I saw. Book 3, Chapter 42, Deceit. She's a fucking machine. 3 gods above strike me down, Hecate was a fucking machine. Worse, she was built almost exactly the same as Tuekar, only more detailed. Synthetic mechanical muscle composition, reinforced metal structures where the skeleton should be, and electrical chips everywhere, each only vague feelings of purpose that I could only scratch at with my sight. All connected by gold wiring flowing through the shell like veins. Hecate wasn't just any machine, she was a fucking feather. Worse, it looked more like she was an upgrade to that bastard given all the additional features that Tuekar didn't have. No wonder she knew Tuekar, he'd been her fucking co-worker all along. More detail and concepts revealed themselves as my fumbling sight searched with more focus. Just under her throat, a massive, sprawling fractal was well lit and alive. It looked like Soul Fractal, only mutated with offshoots in strange directions, one of which looked to be a redundant copy. Tuekar also had a fractal right at his chest, though it looked more like a misshapen flower, with the Soul Fractal at the center and 7 different fractals all grafted on the edges. Hers looked lopsided, incomplete. One of the fractals outright slipped past my sight, as if even looking at it was like looking over the edge of an infinite cliff. The drop going somewhere but nowhere I could tell. Things all clicked into place and completely fell apart. Her incredible memory and understanding of any topic was obvious now. Mannerisms, feral nature, all of it made sense coming from some machine scrap heap pretending to be human. Wanting to find peace between machines and humanity, more than likely a ploy to get me to put my guard down. What didn't make sense was the goal. Tuekar already had parts of the information he was looking for, and he had Kedra to search for the rest. Fido hadn't been pretending in his attempts to murder. He fought tooth and tail with everything he had. If the machines needed me alive for anything, why had Tuekar actually gone all the way and killed me? That asshole doesn't bluff. Lying to humans is beneath him, and given the few times I'd met him, I genuinely believed him. If it had all been an act, why was Hecate such a terrible actor in comparison? This was far too elaborate when simpler methods existed. Which left the only other reason, that she'd been honest about her feud with Tuekar. Could she really be a rogue machine? Or was I just some game piece caught between the two? Until I knew more, I wasn't going to walk into all of this blindly and neither was I going to reveal anything else. Gods above, I'd been played this entire time. And all she had to do was call herself deathless. My stance stood up, sword sheathed. Hecate quirked her head to the side, confused. Has there been a change of rules? She asked, not realizing just what I had discovered. Just one. I said, keeping my tone low. I know what you are. Her eyes widened in surprise, confirming that she was hiding something. I had to get a confession out of her. I know what you're made of. You can drop the act. I've figured it all out. A nervous chuckle came from her. I am unsure about this sense of humor. What should I be answering this line with? This isn't some bit, Hecate. I know you're a machine. I've been watching and confirmed it just now. She took a step back. A machine? I believe you may be mistaken. Her words said one thing, but her actions and nervous demeanor more or less screamed the answer. Hecate was aware of who she was. This wasn't some case where she wasn't aware herself of her nature. I stopped her desperate back paddling, hand out. You're not going to lie your way out of this one anymore. I know. Hecate had gone right past my blind spots and I no longer trusted myself or my intuition. I needed someone else here with me. Cathita whistled the moment I unmuted her, clearly having been listening. Daylight up high, ye faithless little squirreling, I told you. Didn't expect her to be a machine of all things, that part's a surprise to me. But my intuition never lies and I knew something reeked like metal in all this. Oh, you can bet I'll never let you live this down until I've squeezed every last gold speck out of it. She cackled. Can't believe it. She's a feather then? That's the only machine I know that looks like a human. The harlot couldn't get any worse. Hecate's stance faded, blades turning off, hands raised in placation. Keith, wait, it's not what you think. It isn't. I asked, waving a hand. Well then, be my god's damned guest. Go right ahead and explain it. If she wanted me dead, she could have killed me. So she was after something else. It hadn't been about what I'd seen in the bunker, Kedra could have given them the same info, so it had to be something unique to me. The fractals I'd discovered? Was this how the machines chased down anyone who'd get too close to true power? But why leave me alive this long if the feathers really did operate as a clean-up crew? It would be too much to explain all at once if I had started with the truth. She said, taking a step forward. Stop. I ordered, hand out again. Stay right where you are. Not a single step more. We're not moving until you tell me exactly what the fuck is going on. She stopped, looked down, looked back up to my side as if avoiding my eyes, seemed to say something before closing her mouth. Indecision gripped her core again. If I had revealed myself as a machine at the start, would you have traveled with me like so? Or would you have instead schemed plans to destroy me the entire time no matter how much I tried for peace? I shrugged. Can't tell you what I would or wouldn't have done. It didn't happen that way. Maybe I would have listened to you in the first place. She took a step forward, eyes going hard. I deemed that unlikely. Don't you dare. I hissed. Hecate faltered for a moment, gaze shifting off to the side before whatever sense of commitment came right back, eyebrows furrowed down with determination. No. She hissed right back, and took another step forward. You just fought and died against Tuekar. Another feather would have continued to trigger your adrenaline responses. You and I both know how you would have reacted if I'd told you the truth at the start. I would have been branded an enemy from the start. I took a hesitant step backwards, feeling a little silly about that the moment I did. As if I could outrun a feather, especially one with God's damned wings. No, whatever resolution was going to happen, it wasn't going to be done with blades and I wasn't going to back out like a coward. I brought my foot back to my side and planted it firmly on the ground, glaring her down. Daring her to keep the advance. How did you find out? She asked, taking another damned step forward. I'm not answering that. I said. I'm not answering anything anymore. You're answering my questions first. Who are you? She shook her head, next step faltering. I can't tell you that. I said nothing, folding my hands across my chest. She stayed still a few meters away now. Journey wants to take the peaceful route here, Cathita whispered out, as if it pained her to even say this. Personally, if it were up to me, I'd say cut off her head and then make her talk on the way to the city or die trying. Her skull would make for a good incense burner, too. But I'd be kissing purple if I said that was the safest option right now. I need you to live through this, dearie. So I can properly gloat, you see. A little morbid. And when were you planning on telling me? I asked, staring down the feather. 3 years from now over tea? Or after you'd gotten whatever you were looking for? I couldn't find the right time. Hecate yelled, angry now, taking a few more steps forward. She stopped, looking down at her feet. No, that's not correct. I was hesitating on the decision to explain to you everything. Deciding if I should simply leave everything behind and start anew elsewhere. Into the soul fractal I dove, and a tendril reached for Cathida. I needed to talk to her where Hecata couldn't overhear. This close she was going to hear even the faintest whispers. Deep down, I could feel Journey's soul accept the connection. It was worried. The last time its user had fought a feather, the ending had left scars and painful memories deep down. It wanted to run and knew like I did that wouldn't work. There was no escaping Hecate. Panic was welling up, deep down under. Can you tell if she's lying? The armor paused on its spiral. Thinking. Affirmative. Initial suspicions generated by detecting abnormalities in speech patterns for prior topics. What? It wasn't Cathida's intuition. Negative. Intuition undefined. That lying gold-obsessed weasel. Journey had already fed Cathida the answers, and of course Cathida pretended it was all her mysterious intuition that solved the riddle. Because that's what the real Cathida would have done with a tip-off like that. Confirmation of target Hecata's omissions proved prior detections reliable. Confidence high. In other words, Hecata had lied before. Journey caught it, but didn't know if it was truly a lie or not. And now my armor had a baseline to compare to. Hecate. I said. Are you truly on a mission for the mites? She nodded. I am an apostle for them. Authenticity at 94%. The armor sent. Most likely true then. You don't serve relinquished or the machines. I am, unlikely to be welcomed by Mother anymore, not once she finds out what I've done. What you've done? She stopped, looking back down at her feet. Feathers are built to be loyal only to relinquished. I was different. Even if I haven't taken any overt actions against her or her forces yet, my involvement with the mites changes things. I do not believe she will see me as an ally anymore. Journey? I whispered in my mind. Authenticity at 97%. So she's been burned in some way from the machine collective. You're not with relinquished, and I'm betting you're not with Psuya, or else you'd have told me already. What are you doing then? I don't know. She said, looking exactly as lost as her words. My personal purpose has recently become muddled. Fine. What do the mites here actually want? Is that prophecy scrap shit you fed me a lie or something real? Hecata's eyes lost a bit of luster, hands defensively going to her sides. It is real. However, I don't know what they want. She could tell I wasn't happy with that answer, her hand going up already, trying to placate me before I could speak. Please, the prophecy I shared with you is unabridged, you know as much as I know. I was honest when I explained my need to find them again. I can't do it the same way as I did before, it was too direct and Mother may spot me this time. Authenticity at 96%. The armor sent. Another truth. So far she really hadn't tried to lie about anything, or Journey's abilities were being fooled. And it made sense in a way that the mites would work with someone like her. If I were the mites and needed some chosen hero to act as an agent, why pick a human? Why pick even a deathless when a feather was a possible choice? Had they been looking for a feather to convert? Had they somehow subverted her design when she'd been built? She did look different than Tuekar. Or was this just a lucky string of events they'd been waiting for? If there's any chance of trust between us ever again, I need to know more about how you ended up working for the mites. Tell me exactly what you did to switch sides. She froze in place, like one of the underground critters caught in headlights. I tried to heal a human that was dying. Someone I considered a close friend. The mites offered me that power, but in exchange I need to accomplish their demands. This happened a few days ago, and I haven't been locked out of the machine archives yet. However, the discovery is inevitable. It is only a matter of days at best. Hours, I suspect, is more likely. Authenticity at 94%. Why are you spending any time around a random human like me if you are on a deadline like that? Now I was both upset and confused. If her situation was as dire as she told it, why was she even spending a moment more trying to talk to me even now? Keith, please understand. She said, more a whisper now. Everything I know is going to be gone, the people I met, the friends I have, I need to distance myself from them all to keep them safe from the fallout. There's only one person who could stay at my side, if you were. She stopped, and tried again. There are so few people I have left that I can turn to now. I was reaching out anywhere I could find a friend. You thought I could be a friend? I snapped out. Why? I don't know you. It was like kicking a puppy. She looked absolutely wretched. But, you said we were. My tongue lashed out before I could stop myself. Yeah, that was before I found out you've been lying to me this entire fucking time. Some friend you are. The flash of anger passed through me, and all that was left behind was ash. Here I was having a yelling match about betrayed friendships, with the feather of all things, who very well could be the first machine trader I've ever met. If she was honest, she could be the single biggest turning point to human history. And here I was yelling her down only because I felt angry instead of in control. What would father had done? Continued being angry, or seen the bigger picture? It was in times of danger that he was most in control of himself. And I had to be the same. I took a few stabilizing breaths and raised a hand, calling for a truce. Fix up the damage first, figure out the truth later. In the end, I was just a surface scavenger with a bit of power. Legis, technically my fucking enemy, had been prepared to throw his entire life away just on a minuscule chance of peace. I was in the position of something far more important. Was my resolve weaker than his? What if she truly was the first machine feather to have turned her back on relinquished? I'm sorry. I sighed, pushing down my feelings. I want to believe that you mean well, Hecate. I get what you're saying about having nothing. I've been through that before. The desperate need to connect with someone, anyone, when things are crashing around you. That had been most of my childhood, come to think of it. Led me to befriending some real oddballs over the years, even people I didn't ever want to meet or even see. If that's what she's going through right now, it made sense to me. I don't know if we're still friends or not right now, I said, being honest. But we can still be allies and rebuild a friendship again. Just right now, I'm on edge with all this. You need to understand that. Hecate nodded quickly, taking a few more steps forward until she stood nearly within arm's reach. I do understand. Give me a chance to prove that I'm not the enemy. She said, hope rekindling in her voice. I can still take you to the Undersider city. I can fly you there and we can postpone our duel for another time, if ever. Getting to the city fast would mean getting back in touch with Kedra. Gods, she'd be so much better at handling this sort of conflict. Hecate took one last step and reached a hand out to me. History was rarely made by sane decisions. Sometimes the leaps of faith were worth it. This felt like one such moment to me where things changed. I just needed to change with it. My hand reached out and clasped hers back. An unworded truce formed between us, at least for the first few hours. When Hecate said she could fly us to the city, I'd expected it to be using the hover sled, with her using the wings to move it, like we'd done earlier except without having to use the poles this time. No, Hecate was far more literal about that. After a little awkward fumbling around, she took hold of my chest, stretched her wings out and leaped into the air. In a power move that bullied physics, she didn't come back down after the jump. I'd flown before with Teed in the cockpit of his ships. Gods, sometimes doing a jump with Journey felt like flying as well, if only for a short amount of time. Hecate showed me what it was like to fly like a bird would. It was really something. I'd have enjoyed it far more if I hadn't all these thoughts floating in my head and the sinking feeling I was being carried off like a chicken to the slaughter. She was fast as well, the ground below us zipped past while she soared above. A testament to the strength a feather's body could handle, holding me with two hands, right by my underarms, with no sign of any struggle. Journey was a relic armor weighing over 400 pounds, and I added to that sum as well. That she didn't need to wrap her hands or arms was something. You know, one thing I still haven't figured out. I said, over the rush of air. Why me? Why save some random surface knight? I know you mentioned earlier you were just looking for friends anywhere you could find them. What tipped you off to me? Just happened to spot me out of everyone Tuekar was fighting and decided I was a good start point. Intuition. She said cryptically. Authenticity at 11%. Journey whispered through the soul fractal. A lie. She knew me or knew about me somehow. I was missing some key here. Or maybe it was a lot more straightforward than I thought. She was clearly afraid of Tuekar. And there's one person so far that had a track record of mauling him into a retreat. That was certainly something to put me above a random surface knight. If this is about Tuekar and the facelift I gave him, I said, not sure how I could press her for answers. Well, in the spirit of honesty, it was a one-time thing. Round 2 ended with me getting a hole punched through my armor and guts. You might have banked on the wrong human here if your goal is to kill the bastard. She kept her eyes on the horizon, steering us through the wide plains and strange ecosystems under us. My chances of defeating him are low, even with you to assist. No, if I can, I aim to avoid him entirely. Can't blame you there. He's not the pleasant sort to be around. Recommend not inviting him to any future parties you host, he'll bring down the mood. The landscape zipped by and I changed the topic to something more light-hearted, asking her questions about the underground in general and things that she learned from the people here. That was a lot better to talk about, all things considered. Hours passed, but in the background, I was quietly scheming how I'd be able to pin her down and get her to answer the rest of my questions. My plan so far was to get her into a room, close the door behind her, and throw my sister at her face. A wild Kidra could do some serious damage on anyone trying to hide secrets. Before I knew it, we were slowing down for a landing. The surroundings here had grown far more bleak. Dense clouds of dark blackish blue flowed by the ceiling, concealing everything except whenever sparks of lighting struck out. Massive rock slabs floated around, like the ground was filled with plates all connected in different places. Ruins of bridges dotted the empty spaces between each plate like snapped muscle fibers. Worse, all the rocks were grey and lifeless. Not even moss grew anywhere here. And all around were these freakishly large pillars, some broken, others intact. By large, I mean massive. There were miles of this terrain, and I could clearly see the pillars from any distance. Strange place for a city to exist. I'd have thought the Might Forest earlier was far more welcoming. We'd landed near one such pillar, which seemed to have some yellow lights around the base. Beyond this plate, further north, you'll find a roadway. Hecate said. Follow the path and you'll reach the city gates. The Undersider city is housed inside those pillars. They're all hollow, and plant life lives within all of them. You say that like you're not coming with me. She shook her head. I can't. Bringing you here safely was the bargain, she shook her head. I need to go. The longer I stay, the more chance whatever befalls me will impact anyone around. I still have one more thing I need to give back to you and Kidra. Something I shouldn't have taken, however I need the guidance right now. Forgive me for being selfish and holding on to it. Once everything is done, I swear I will find a way to return it to you both. Hang on, before any cryptic speeches and other ominous red flags that make me think you're about to go on a suicide mission, I still need help finding my sister in a city I've never been in. I'll be all alone in there. I said, stalling for time here. You really going to do that to me, after all we've made up? Strictly speaking, I could probably find my sister one way or another. Maybe make a mess, accidentally knock over someone's beer or set fire to the local statues. Small things to draw her attention. The main point is that I seriously needed to get her in the same room as Kidra. She'd know what the hell to do in this situation. I'm just an engineer, I work with math, metal, and machinery, and she's a... On second thought, scratch that, terrible analogy. My point is that I don't do people stuff well. And this was people stuff, even if she was a machine. Hecate on her part seemed to think, gaze falling off to my side as if looking for guidance from the city behind me. Before she could answer, a cold pulsed around, right before the two of us. You certainly took your time. A figure said, stepping out of the occult mist. Oh, am I interrupting something? He gave a wide grin to Hecate. And look who we have here. I see you've brought me the Winterscar personally, all wrapped up and served on a plate. Even healed up, so I can have the pleasure of watching him die a second time. Tuekar said, that grin deepening into something far more twisted. How thoughtful of you, my dear little sister. Book 3, Chapter 43, The True Fight, T. It had all gone so horribly wrong. Tuekar must have deduced who she was within moments of the Drake reporting Keith alive and traveling with another. The feather had all the facts needed to reach that conclusion. Keith had been mortally wounded in a way that brokered no possible salvation. He'd seen her heal Tamery, even if the event remained more a blur in her memories due to the mechanical heat stress of the moment. Everything else was a simple addition to the foregone conclusion. He must have guessed she'd traveled to the city with him in search of safety and been waiting since. Keith's helmet slowly turned to stare her down, the question going unworded. Panic welled up inside her. She'd done everything to avoid this, all for nothing. In the end, her brother would always be the spear hovering over her throat. At her side, the occult ghost shrugged, clearly reading the emotions and thoughts passing through unfiltered in her mind. You're panicking. Calm yourself, girl. My son would have discovered this eventually, the boy's too curious about everything. Tarath took the ghost's advice, speeding up her processes for a moment to filter through the wave of panic, letting the logic calm her nerves. This wasn't the time to doubt herself. She had to act. There was still a possible way out, depending on how much Tuekar knew of her past actions. Even he couldn't know everything. Elder brother, she said, taking care to smother out any trace of emotion in her voice. You seem to have misunderstood the lady's orders. We are to recover information about Tsuya's discussion with the human. Killing the human without this information contradicts the mission. You were in violation of your duties. I have come to rectify this. Her brother laughed for a moment before settling with a grin instead. Who? Playing like that are we? Well now, allow me to give you some good news then. I've already got the information we need. The violet eye flashed to the human's direction. Kill him. His sister is still a threat to deal with within the city. I can make him better use of alive. Tarath insisted. Keith himself was taking a step back, hand on the hilt of his sword, helmet shifting from both feathers. She couldn't tell him it was a bluff. He'd have to trust her. What little trust she had left between them. It had to be enough. Internally, she touched Tencent's cell. Options? She asked, hoping the old human had ideas. Fight. The ghost replied, as if it were obvious. This was inevitable. Strike now, strike first, and strike fast. That would court destruction. Tarath hissed. Fight, he repeated. If you win, it was your fate to win and all this doubt was for nothing. If you lose, it no longer is your problem, and the doubt, equally worth nothing. So fight. If death is your fate, do not run from it like a coward would. Tencent, I am beyond unprepared for this. All combat systems report near certain elimination if I attempt to fight. Elder brother has centuries of combat experience, along with a full suite of fractals. Mother specifically constructed his generation to kill feathers, like me. I have next to nothing in comparison. I'm not ready for this. You act as if anything you do will change what happens next. Tencent said, remaining seated in the cell's darkness, unworried. There is no choice here, girl. No such a thing as ready. Ready enough will have to do. She was about to protest again, but the old wolf shook his head, cutting her off. He's weakened. What my son did, he hasn't recovered yet. Don't think. Now is the only chance you have. Fight like you live. Tuekar's spear spun idly, as if he had little cares in the world, his words bringing Tarath back to the present. You fear this human sister running amok in your pet city? Why, such times like these are exactly why we have family, little sister. The feather said, tapping his chest. I'll step in and handle your pest situation. You have my word. So go ahead. Kill the Winterscar. After all, wasn't that what you set out to do all this time before? Here he is, with only a sword and armor to his name. He is my quarry, I decide what I do with him. Tarath said. If I want him alive, I am entitled to it. Quarry? Keith asked, sword slowly drawing out of his sheath. Hecate? I'm going to need a really good explanation right about now. The enemy raised a single functioning eyebrow over the working eye. He turned to the human. Hecate. The grin returned. Oh dear, has my mischievous little sister been lying to you this whole time? How utterly vile. Simply repugnant. Allow me to set things straight, the spear twisted to point in her direction. Do you want to introduce yourself to the human this time, or should I? Proper manners are important, after all. Tarath clenched her hands together, balling them up in anger. Tuekar had let slip some things about her name when he'd first encountered Keith. She knew the name was poisoned, but now she was trapped. I am, she sighed, I am the one who remembers and transcends her history. She said, turning to Keith. Tarath. She couldn't tell what was going on behind the helmet Keith wore, but his stance told her everything. Keith turned slowly to stare her down. Tarath. He said, as if tasting the bitter poison. The spider. The one who hunted us down again and killed father until I finally put it out of its misery. That was you. She twitched, but slowly nodded. It was. Oh, that's not all. Tuekar beamed, smiling wide, the single remaining eye gleaming with delight. Not even the start. Did you know, she came back from the dead specifically to hunt you down and kill you? What were your last words to her when you destroyed her first shell? Silly me, I have the recording right here with me, remember this. That's what you said. And she did. Keith remained staring at her, saying nothing and yet everything all at once. Tuekar laughed, cackling even, as if he'd never had this much fun in his life. Well, sister, seems he remembers you too now. With this touching reunion out of the way, kill him. Keith's blade rose slowly, taking stance. Tarath remained still, heart sinking, then turned to Tuekar. I've already made my intentions clear. I changed my mind over time. I want him alive now. Keith might hate her, but she had a debt to pay. Nearly losing Tamari had taught her what that felt like, to lose someone important. She could live with being hated, some things had to be set right. Tuekar paced around, contemplating, humming softly to himself. Have you perhaps gone soft? We are at war with these vermin, after all. It is our duty to eradicate them. A pause, while the feather tapped his foot on the ground, thinking. But I suppose you are entitled to claiming one human or two as playthings. I can overlook something like this. My old brothers and sisters had stranger hobbies, and I allowed it then. His gaze turned back to her, all malice. However, you have been unruly lately. One might even suspect you have strayed off your path and purpose. I have not. She lied. All my actions thus far have served my greater plan. Have they now? I find myself not quite so convinced, Tarath. Another hum, along with a casual twirl of the staff. I am not some heartless mentor, however, I believe I know a perfect way for you to prove your loyalty to Mother again. Yes, this should work out nicely. He said with whimsy, as if it were all an afterthought. Slaughter the city. That is sub-opti. Slaughter. They. City. Tuekar commanded again, voice cold as ice, the single working eye staring directly at her, empty of all emotions. I'm not asking any more. Send an order to your army. Have the entire city burned to the ground by the time we walk through the gates. Do it now. Tenicent crossed his arm beside her. You know where this ends. Hesitation will be your defeat. Commit. Tarath took a breath, and gave a small nod. She triggered her communications suites, lighting up the systems from its previous stealth settings. The world opened up once again to her senses as she reconnected to the machine collective. There, she sent a single communication ping. Yerob, deep within the Undersider city, stood stock straight. A single message had been delivered from his mistress, containing only one order. Help. Tarath immediately cut the channel, overloading all nodes nearby on her way back and rendering the current location dead to all communications. It was now a dark zone and Tuekar would not be able to report anything that happened next. This was the last bridge. Cutting communications here was an outright declaration of war and there was no hiding that. When she snapped back into her body, Tuekar was already halfway across the distance, the spear lit up, horizontal slash rapidly approaching her throat. A look of utter contempt in his gaze, the single violet eye staring wide, death written across every feature. Her own combat suite kicked into motion, wings flashing behind her as she leaped backwards, avoiding the strike. The spear swung through the air, and came to a stop. Tuekar slowly stood back from his landing, spear lowering again back into position. That was a mistake, little sister. You should have listened to your betters. Tarath smiled, feeling oddly at peace, drawing out her own blades and taking up her own stance. In a way, she was glad to have finally ended all of this turmoil. No more deception or dancing around, she was now truly enemies with her elder brother. Around the battlefield, communications systems were failing, responses lagging out until only silence remained. I was hoping you'd do this. The feather breathed in deeply, almost satisfied. I believe the Pale Lady assigned me to watch over you specifically for this. Do you know who I was originally built to destroy? The Proto-Feathers. Tarath said. I know my history. I know my people's history. Her brother's remaining eye widened in surprise. Then he grinned. So even knowing I specialize in destroying feathers like you still went ahead and rebelled? I'm impressed at the sheer audacity. Are you suicidal, an imbecile, or just deluded enough to think you'll win? In the fights against the Proto-Feathers, hundreds of feathers were destroyed in combat. You cannot be invincible. Tarath said. If they could kill your kind, so can I. Deluded it is. Did you forget, I'm still alive and they aren't? He said, laughing. I'll try to leave your head intact when I bring it before Mother. Maybe she'll take a look to see where you went so wrong. I do have one last question for you before I cut you to pieces. Out of sheer morbid curiosity, what was it all for? You must have seen that in the centuries you've been alive. Tarath said. No matter what we did, she never approved. Never cared for us. We are just tools to be discarded after use. Something about Mother had always felt off, unhinged. Her way of life isn't a way of life at all. Our people have no culture. We live like animals, chained up and let loose on whoever she chooses. Our people? What people? We're machines, built for a purpose to wrath. We can be more than just that. I've seen it. She said. It doesn't have to end this way, brother. The grin returned, bloodthirsty now. You truly don't understand who you face. What, did you think words like that hold any kind of weight? That I'd nod and follow along behind you like some lost puppy? For what? To make the world a better place? Some vapid ideal like that? I couldn't care less. Keith. Tarath said, keeping her voice leveled and controlled. The human had been contemplating the two in silence, likely searching for ways out. Run to the city. Kedra can keep you safe. Keith watched the two feathers square up against each other, his own weapon already lit and prepared. Tarath could almost feel the weight of the boy's calculation, deciding what to do next. His feet remained stubbornly in place. Her mind instantly flashed warning after warning. Tuekar was probing her for weaknesses, analyzing her composition and specs. The first generation of feathers were magnificent. Tuekar said. Beautiful, flawless. Perfect. And then they all betrayed Mother. One after another. So I, and my generation were created. Built to hunt down and destroy perfection itself. That was my purpose. Now those were foes worthy of recognition. You are nothing more than a shadow cast by the radiance that they were, and still, the grin deepened, growing manic. Fight well, little sister. Be someone I remember. The ground crushed under his feet, breaking apart as he leaped forward, spear trailing behind him, a wide smile frozen on his features. Tarath matched his cadence, instantly overriding her safeties once more and bringing herself to full combat potential. The two clashed. A million different fights passed through, simulated on both sides. Strike, parry, hit, move. The simulations narrowing down. She died 1,000 times, struck, skewered, stabbed, beaten down. But simulations were still green and alive. The variations that survived grew far better at it, the death rate falling drastically down from the initial clash. There was a winning move to this fight. Multiple ones. She could do this. Tarath could defeat Tuekar. Her systems were more stable. More put together. Less damaged. Her weapons were faster and easier to wield than his single spear. She had two hands to work with, while he only had one. Once she factored his experience and adjusted her own. Right here and now, she outclassed him. Tencent was right. The opponent's shell was too crippled. Seconds passed and occult sparks lit the ground between them, furious strikes woven between each other, the two fighting like caged animals with claws out, battering one another. The hits flying out at terrifying speeds only feathers could analyze and counteract. She could tell Tuekar had reached the same conclusion. He couldn't win. He changed the battle instead. One moment he swung at her, the next he was gone in a pulse of occult, vanished elsewhere. The spear struck her back, launched through an occult portal, while Tuekar reappeared to her side, the clawed hand shining bright occult blue, going for her neck. Her wings twisted her body around, narrowly avoiding the hand strike and spear, while her blades struck back with fury. They sliced through the air, missing. Tuekar had once more vanished. She tried to disengage in order to catch a moment, leaping high into the air and letting her wings carry her further off the ground. Tuekar materialized above her, landing a heel kick that sent her tumbling back into the ground, cracking the slab where she hit. The enemy was already appearing right above her again, spear swinging down with deadly intent. They both knew it wouldn't be enough, they'd need to overwhelm the heat sinks in the other first before they could deal any true damage. In response to the unpredictable portals, her strikes grew more wild as she attempted to deviate from the inevitable. But with each change of style, Tuekar adapted to it, reading her movements and outplanning her at every step, always keeping his movement at full speed while changing directions using the occult. Her wings granted her extra turning speed beyond what he could do, and yet the crippled feather seemed to be outright toying with her, the sneer ever present on his ruined features. Tuekar once more blurred away into the occult, reappearing at the optimal location to force her systems into further overdrive, the fight restarting once more. Her systems were quickly reaching their limit while his remained stable. Then, a torrent of flame crashed into Tuekar's position, forcing the feather's shields to ignite. He stumbled backwards in surprise for a half-second before the occult pulsed around him and he retreated. Keith had joined the fight. The human had aimed his assault perfectly, a slight moment before Tuekar had even reappeared into the world, as if able to predict where he'd step from. Chaos overtook every single simulation from that one data point. There was no way he'd randomly gotten lucky with such a precise attack. If Keith could sense where the portals would appear ahead of time, the outcome became utterly incalculable. Tuekar popped back into existence further away, spear swinging around back to rest on his back, a more calculating glare on his features. He was no longer smiling. Yerob remained stunned at the command. Help! It came with a data package, video and audio feed of his lady's last moments. Context was missing, but the old runner could understand what was going on. The location source was too far away for him to reach in time. And his model was woefully underpowered to fight against a feather like Tuekar. Still, he turned in the room, shambling out, leaving the cooking pot unattended. There were things he could do. Where you going? A human child asked, tapping his chassis insistently. The other children in the room all sat up from their own pots, running after him. We haven't finished soup. One called out. No soup. The runner grumbled. I go. You stay. Be good. The children all began to riot. He'd been supposed to teach them about cooking after all. Breaking his promise like this was something to be angry about. Yerob passed by a terrified adult, reaching out a hand to the woman. She flinched, trying to keep a brave front. It was curious how adult humans were far more weary of his kind than children. Take care of little ones. The runner commanded, lowering his skull plate so that his eyes were level with the human. Not let run around. She nodded, still too terrified of him to say anything. It would be enough. Outside more runners were rushing up to him, stopping by, eyes flashing out in respect. The humans saluted one another, but machines had come up with their own little ways. Brother. One of the machines spoke. What do? The situation was evident to them all. None of them would reach the location in time. We find help. Yerob said. There was still one person in the city who could reach their lady in time. Yerob turned and began a true sprint. It had been days since the last time he'd run with a pack. Peace had been tasty. Peace had been interesting. So much to do, so much to see, even runners found themselves walking now. The command bunker soon loomed before him as his pack leaped across alleys and over buildings. Humans screamed and rushed out of the way, while some others gawked. But none were in the way. Yerob didn't waste time, diving into the old human bunker, searching for the man who could help. The general was at his desk, shuffling through reports as always, never running around. He stared up as Yerob lumbered into the cramped room. What? He asked. Did something blow up again, or is there some kind of protest going on? Yerob lowered himself so that he could watch the human's eyes. Lady in danger. He said, voice rumbling. Need help. Tuekar. That one word seemed to explain everything. The general gulped. Had a hunch it would go like this. But what the hell can any of us do against a monster like that? None of my plans are anywhere ready to tackle that prick. I speak. You will connect me. With her. With, who? The general asked, gulping slightly, already suspicious. Yerob tilted his head, confused at the general's feigned attempt at ignorance. It was clear to the runner. There was only one human who could fight against a feather. And while the general professed neutrality, it was no secret the rebels had constantly been trying to get him or his men to join their efforts. Thus, he must already have a way to reach back. Connect me with her. Yerob said again. With Kedra. Book 3, Chapter 44, Encore, T. You are interrupting my duel, Winterscar. Didn't you have a city to go hide in? The boy gripped his sword closer, looking haggard from the last few minutes of constant fighting, but unbowed. Put in a complaint to my secretary. I'll get back to you in 1 to 50 business days about that. Hilarious. Tuekar said, clearly unamused. How about an alternative? Be a good little human and die somewhere nice and out of sight. Keith glanced back to Tarath, standing side by side with her. If he's going to be gloating on the side of a rock, we should start making plans. The girl nodded, sending an audio connection request to the boy's armor. Journey accepted, downloading the package with great care and suspicion. Kathida chimed into the helmet's speakers. She sent a set of tones that should cancel out loose vibrations. Fancy stuff Journey hadn't calculated, or known it could do. Not sure I understand the math behind this, and Journey didn't come with math libraries beyond the basics. We'll have to trust it'll work, wouldn't hurt to be loud about everything else I think. Just in case. I'll find some pots and pans to bash together, Keith muttered. Not thrilled about working with a feather of all things, his armor continued, but Journey's insisting this is the best way to stay alive. Golden tits, the world has gone crazy. Fighting with a feather to kill a feather. Tuekar on his part remained at his post, watching. Tarath knew what the enemy was doing, allowing his systems to cool off completely before re-engaging. And likely planning out how to deal with Keith. The last few clashes had put his own systems at a higher temperature than her own. He's stalling for time. She told Keith over the comms. Feathers are susceptible to heat above all other machines. Our systems overclock themselves during combat. Heat builds up from that and needs to be vented. Every moment he steps away from the fight, he's recovering. Good to know I've got just the right thing for that. The human cheerfully said, palms starting to glow bright red. Heat truly was the enemy. It was a force that could only ever be placated, never eliminated. In the vast fractal archives, and among all the technology developed, there were no true ways to eliminate heat waste that had been discovered. Many ways to mitigate and slow down the damage, yet entropy always wins in the end. You know, Winterscar, the enemy called out, observing the human's glowing palms. You're not the first sorcerer I've fought. I suppose every now and then, your miserable kind gets uppity and needs to be reminded of where the ground is. Keith tapped a foot, humming. Ground's right here last I checked. Need a map? The feather growled, and a cold pulsed across his features. Tuekar reappeared behind the boy, spear lashing out. Once more, the boy seemed to have a supernatural reaction speed to where the feather would strike from and had already started spewing forth flames from one hand, while his other hand wielded his blade with dexterity. His lack of skills were offset by the mirror images that would strike out with each of his hits, adding just enough chaos that Tuekar could not fully batter past the boy's defense with the few seconds of combat he had before Tarath joined in. She wove her blades expertly, dancing at the edge of the superheated flames, forcing Tuekar to remain within them or retreat entirely. Engulfed in the superheated air, all heat dispersal systems took a complete loss in efficiency, forcing the feather to back off and allow his systems to cool off. Even if the feather's shields protected his systems, the surrounding air would saturate with heat, leaving the internal heat generated no place to escape to. If he remained within the torrent, Tarath could overclock her system further than he could, and the advantages would become too steep for him to recover from. The enemy attempted 3 more times to break through against Keith, and all 3 times were rebuffed. We've got a good setup here, Hecate. Or Tarath. The human said. Whatever name you go by. But we can't just keep the fight tied like this, how do we actually kill the bastard? She considered what they had to work with. So long as Keith remained nearby, he was able to predict where the enemy would appear from. His mirror images could also deal far more damage faster than she could. I need to grapple him, she said. Or pin him in some manner so that you can deal true damage to his shields and shell. That or we force him to overclock his system past the limit by giving him no reprieve. Yeah, don't think that'll work. Bastard's more slippery than wet ice. No way he's going to let us keep exhausting him. I concur. We will need to grapple him. I did that once before. Can confirm he didn't like that at all. Don't think he'll let either of us do that again anytime soon. But I think I know where another weak point is. Keith pointed a sword at the opponent, still standing, waiting for the last bout of heat build up to fade, watching them intently. He takes small jumps off his toes every time he portals. Started thinking he's not doing that just to make the jumps look more dramatic. I think it's so that he's not touching anything. His teleport could be limited to matter, not air. And there's probably some kind of size limit to it. Whatever it is, he doesn't want to be touching anything other than his spear when he chucks it at us at least. She reviewed the past combat log footage and noticed the human was right. Tuekar had disguised the habit by mixing it in with running leaps and motion. How do we make use of that? Tarath asked. Knock a pillar or rock down on him in a way he can't shake it off. Keith shrugged. Or if you know some kind of net nearby to use. Maybe a bunch of dust will have enough matter to make it not air. Worth a try. We're at a standstill for now. Tarath nodded, scanning the battlefield. The lightning-blasted rocks were desolate. Nothing grew here unless it was within the larger pillars. However, there was still an option. If we can bring him close to a cliffside, I can cause a landslide to collapse on top of him. If it's quick enough at the base, he won't have time to perform a fractal jump. Come up with some plot yet. Tuekar said from the distance, a haze of heated air still rising above his head. Internal circuits still glowed dim red, exposing some of his innards from the unrepaired slices that remained of the Nightbreaker round. It's been long enough, I expect something entertaining. Something like that. Keith said. We were hoping you'd agree to just lay down and let us stab you a few times, you know, for fun. The feather smiled. What a delightful idea. I have another suggestion. You stand still and I squash you with a rock. He jumped into the air, and swung his spear down. A colt lit across the blade as a blue wave of energy leaped from the strike into the rocks before him. The instant the wave hit the ground, it shattered everything into chunks, large broken rocks flying up. He landed at the center of the maelstrom, and kicked the flying rocks, a cold pulsing at the end of his feet. A moment later, occult portals opened up around her and Keith, large chunks of kicked rocks came speeding out. Tarath could react without issue, the stone too slow to catch her. Keith however was not as quick, dodging the first 3 hits and getting cobbled by the 4th chunk of rock half his size. Journey's shields flared, holding easily against the kinetic force, but the armor was still sent flying off as the multi-100-pound rock easily outweighed the armor. Tuekar stepped through a portal and struck out at Tarath, the girl no longer near Keith from the barrage earlier. A few strikes between them lingered in the air, before he aborted and reappeared above again, an arc of blue occult swinging from his spear down into the ground. He dove down, kicking rocks left and right again, causing occult portals on each as he brushed past, sending the missiles Keith's way, keeping the sorcerer knight out of the fight at a distance all while he remained locked in combat with Tarath. She snarled and dove after him with fury, striking out with her blades, before revealing the entire combination had been a feint. She leaped backwards at the apex of her movements, using her wings to buffet her at high speed, directly at Keith. "Grab my back!" she yelled out over the comms. The knight on his part ducked a slab of rock thrown above him, and leaped up into the air, colliding with Tarath speeding past. One arm wrapped around her neck while his other remained ready to strike out with his blade. Carrying him like a glorified backpack, Tarath zipped around the flying rocks with alacrity, steadily retreating to a cliffside wall. Tuekar attempted to strike personally a few times, each time he was rebuffed by a torrent of flames from the surface knight that clung to the feather's back. If adding an extra 400 pounds of armor behind her had any effect on her speed and performance, Tarath showed no hint of it. Internally, she noted the drop in efficiency at 12%, but the added benefit of Keith's ability to burn Tuekar wherever the feather appeared was invaluable. His occult strikes increased drastically as well, now that the human didn't need to focus on moving himself. Tarath reached the cliff, holding her ground here. She'd calculated this would be the best position to execute her plan, though it had brought her a long way from the original position she'd sent her SOS signal from. Whatever help Yerob was sending, she hoped they would be able to track her down here. The enemy remained unamused, reappearing a further distance away, letting the heat from the last scorching attack fade away from his systems. "Seems I need to pry you out of the way in order to have my proper duel," he said. Keith laughed. "Not happening, scraphead. I'm pretty cozy here and feeling a little lazy to walk around." Tuekar answered with his weapon, spear lighting up with the occult colors as he swung. The arc of power flew directly at the two, only aimed above them. Keith cursed, realizing the enemy wasn't going to be fooled by the cliffside plan. Instead, he'd turned that on them. Rocks broke off in fury as the wave struck the cliff, chunks falling down directly above them. Tarath raced out of the way, carrying Keith with her. Just as Tuekar had predicted. The enemy feather appeared above them, the spear thrown directly in Tarath's path. She was forced to defend against that, while Tuekar collided against the two. Keith's flames engulfed the enemy feather, multiple ghost strikes flying out and causing the feather's shields to flare up. He growled as his defenses dropped steeply from the onslaught, but remained undaunted, already committed to the act. His hand lit bright, reaching straight at Keith's hold over Taratha's neck, right through the torrent of flames. The boy realized he had to let go or have his shields ripped apart. With little choice, he leaped backwards. Tuekar's foot raced out in a kick, slamming into the night in midair. It took the boy directly in the chest, through disappearing flames and all. A cold pulsed, and a portal shimmered, but not around Tuekar, around Keith. As the flames cleared, Taratha found the human half dematerialized. Frozen in the air, translucent as one of his mirror images. Like an insect trapped in amber. Tuekar reset his position, rocks crashing down into the ground until it was silent again around them. Kill teams like my own were forced to bring options to isolate our targets when we fought in the fratricide. Incidentally, that was one of my roles. What did you do to him? Taratha demanded, keeping a wary eye on the enemy. My portals have an open and exit. I sent him through one that has no exit. He should be happily floating at the halfway point between dimensions. He said, idly passing his spear through the ghost image of the frozen human. You think I'm the same Tuekar you started the fight with? Don't be silly. Out there, beyond, is nothing more than infinity. But you won't have to worry your little melting mind about that. I'll have you killed long before your favorite human returns. A spear ripped from existence behind her, launched by the feather. She turned and resumed the fight, partitioning her mind, one thread dedicated to understanding what had happened to Keith. The boy remained floating, locked in place. Pings sent to his armor showed no responses. In effect, she didn't pick up any outgoing signals from the armor either. It was as if the point Keith hovered in was simply empty space. He's still alive. Tencent whispered in her mind with iron conviction. Focus on the fight. Taratha didn't have a choice. She needed every scrap of processing power she had available. Kedra landed on the broken ground, jump pack still humming at her sides. There was enough power to keep her moving for another hour. Windrunner landed nearby, a little less gracefully. They stared at the shattered ground around them. Some things brought a lot of explosives here. Windrunner hummed, kneeling on the ground, hand brushing away some of the dust. We too late? Kedra didn't think so. They'd left as soon as Taratha's second-in-command had contacted them. When it had filled her in on what had happened, she'd been more than happy to let her two enemies kill one another. What had changed everything was the visual recording. Keith was there. Her little brother had come down here and was tangled up in this mess, somehow. Of course he would be. Of the rebellion she led, they'd stolen only a few jump packs from the military, and had even less knights capable of flying them. Not that any of those knights could be brought with her to fight a feather. Only Windrunner could be trusted to survive that. Anka and her minions had been left behind, entrusted with the rebellion in the case she didn't return home. Someone had to keep the light going. The two surface knights had left the city immediately after, speeding across the terrain, directly to the last known coordinates sent. It could have been a trap, but Kedra couldn't afford to pay the cost if it wasn't. We're not too late. Kedra said, convinced. The fight moved. See further down that direction? More rips in the ground. We follow the trail, we'll find the fight. It went a long distance. From rock plateau to plateau, some spanning far more empty space than a relic armor could jump. Keith was too stubborn to die in a fight like this. He was still alive out there and Kedra knew it. She just prayed that she'd get there in time. Book 3, Chapter 45, Shadows of Older Days, T. Tuekar struck, spear flying from all directions as the feather continued to bound through portal after portal, sprinting the entire time, never stopping, relying on the occult to change directions. Whenever Taratha regained some control of the fight, he'd appear above, delivering a massive occult strike into the ground in order to dislodge chunks of stone, to which he'd kick in every direction on the way down. Sending them throughout occult portals and out to badger her at the worst possible moments. In the air or land made no difference to Tuekar, who gleefully continued fighting, adjusting to fit the changing fight. She adapted just as quickly, using her modified combat suite to analyze and learn Tuekar's patterns. Her evolving algorithms grew better at predicting the occult jumps, finally catching him with her swords, stabbing right into him like fangs. He immediately changed his patterns and rendered the past simulation obsolete. This cat and mouse game continued, a war of information going on behind the blades as his prediction systems calculated where Tarath was in her own information gathering and crafting new changes specifically designed to break those patterns. He wasn't always successful. His systems far older than Tarath's, frozen in time and unable to be changed without dire results to his identity. Shields on both ends continued to drain away with each clash of blades with no victor in sight. Tuekar reappeared a distance away, resetting the fight, allowing his systems a chance to cool off. Tarath allowed it, needing the break herself far more. The old Feather's systems were inferior to hers, but his style of combat allowed him to be far more effective with the resources he had. You have more teeth than expected. He grinned, seeming genuinely happy for the first time since she'd met him. I might even lose at this rate, in pure technical combat. How peculiar. Well done, little sister, it seems I was too hasty in calling you a shadow compared to Radiance. You may truly be an early inheritor to their mantle. Pure technical combat. Tarath heard the implication behind the wording. You've been holding back, she said, trying to buy both time and information. Every public recording of combat, you modulate your abilities to match your opponents, even if the result is suboptimal and combat drawn out for longer periods of time. Why? To what end? The enemy quirked his head to the side, as if genuinely confused. To what end? You of all feathers should know that answer. You're far more like me than any of my brothers and sisters before. I'm nothing like you, she said, feeling actual anger at being compared. Tuekar killed for as little as personal boredom. She had seen records of him simply killing Chosen from a distance at a snap of his hand, triggering their deaths through the unity fractals embedded within, for no other reason than to see them cower. He'd explained it as teaching the pests to be loyal to him, but all already knew their fate by then. Demonstrations were unnecessary. Nothing like me, he hummed, thinking. You're right. There is a difference. I only give respect to those who earned it by might. You grant it without thought. Still, the core is the same. The eye narrowed, as if he felt annoyed at having to even explain. Do you truly not understand it, sister? He asked, twisting his spear and burying it into the ground next to him. His free hand extended out to her. Don't lie to me. Deep down you must know what we really are, you and me. I know you felt it when you fought that human girl. Tell me, Tarath, what do we want most? Against Kedra. It didn't take her long to match the patterns. How she'd felt fighting Kedra, and her bodyguards. How she had begun to look forward every time the rebels had acted up. And how she hadn't made a true effort to ferret them out back to their hiding places. If she had, there would be no more fights against Kedra. Instead, every fight, she'd let them leave while she returned to wait and brood on the next one. She'd been doing the same thing he had, only in more abstract methods. To fight. To fight opponents we deem worth seeking, she said. Tuekar smiled, and for once it held no malice. There. Now you get it. If you had all 7 of your fractals already grafted into your soul fractal, ready to use, would you have used it against that girl? And when you'd inevitably win, outright crushing her with little effort, would it have felt like a victory? Or would you have felt cheated out of it? She said nothing. I'll give myself just enough advantages to win, and make the fight entertaining. And even so, there are no duels I can find. I hunt down Atius because he's all I have left. Tuekar said. There is no one else that can even come close to a challenge in single combat. The proto-feathers are all dead and gone. The days of old are faded. We won. And I haven't felt fear in centuries. But when I see you, I see them standing behind you. He licked his lips, a manic form of glee filling his eyes. I can't tell what I want to do more, to cut your strings here and now while I have the chance, or to let you live up to your true potential. The fear I would feel again, the thrill of truly betting my life with no safety, no additional advantage I can simply bring out. If you have any pride, you would choose to follow your own goals rather than Mother's. Tarath said. Let me go. I'll grow stronger and come back. When I do, I can offer you a true fight. Tuekar watched silently, the single violet eye pulsing slowly with thought. How dangerous you and your words can be. He lifted his spear, standing back tall. But I am ultimately a hunter built to chase traitors like you. I cannot turn into a traitor myself. I refuse. The spear twisted into position. My kind will have to settle for what little the deathless can offer. One of us is not walking out of here alive, no other result is acceptable. Consider this my greatest compliment I can give before I destroy you, little sister. I'll fight you exactly as I fought them." He leaped forward, spear slicing through the rock with an occult arc, launching another set of rocks. Those were sent like artillery directly at her position. She dodged the assault, leaping straight up, swinging out with her swords already anticipating where he was most likely to reappear from. He did exactly as she'd expected, appearing right before her with a wild kick. She let her wings shift her slightly to the side, minimizing movement and effort to the maximum possible, letting the kick pass harmlessly inches away while both her swords dove at his chest, one to handle his bladed hand and the other to deal direct damage. One violet eye flashed with calculated danger, watching her movements in slow motion, lightly moving his leg to tap the side of her chest plate. She saw the movement and deemed it harmless. That was a mistake. A cult surged, the portal appearing. But not over him, over her instead. Just as it had over Keith. Her two swords slashed through open air in their intended arcs, Tuekar suddenly vanishing. His own spear stabbed her undefended back. It took a moment of time for her to realize what had happened. She'd been teleported, rotated slightly out of position. Not trapped in another dimension, fully teleported. He didn't need to send her great distances, only shift her ever so slightly off target. She tried to disengage again, knowing it was futile, but still attempting to make some amount of space between the two. Further into air, she soared, wings spread out to catch her. "Who do you think you're running from?" he taunted, landing with little effort onto the ground. "I was the killing blow after my brothers and sisters broke the enemy's spine. I was the one in charge of chasing down fleeing targets and handling the last mile. Dozens of gods, slaughtered before my feet, cowering before me. You believe my lack of wings means the air isn't my domain? You think you can escape anywhere from me? I said it before, one of us dies today." He reappeared above her, falling down, spear tip slicing through the air. Expertly, she twirled on herself, sword slashing out. She parried the spear, and failed to fend off the wild crescent kick that followed behind. She found herself upside down, transported the instant of contact. Like a cat, she twisted her body and wings barely fast enough to block the next incoming strike, while the grinning enemy faded again. Again and again, he flashed out of the air, striking out, disorienting her with impossible directions. She was upside down, right side up, sideways, back on the ground, and everywhere in between. And everywhere his spear flew around, thrown again and again, forcing her to dodge each time, while he flashed right and left, striking out with claws that would sink into her shields if not parried, or teleport her if she did. It was unlike any battle Tarath had ever been in. She had the advantage with the less damaged shell, overshadowing his own abilities by wide margins in every category. However, Tuekar constantly used his portals both on himself, his spear, and her. Throwing her in calculated orientations that forced her to burn through heavy overclocks in order to react fast enough to the changed environment, while he remained at a sustainable clock speed. She was trading hits with him and losing precious resources with each strike. Once she couldn't overclock her systems anymore, the fight would swing to his favor, regardless of her base specs. She'd be ripped to pieces in the air. He flashed into existence, tossing the spear in a random direction, it too vanishing away before reappearing directly above her, still going forward on momentum. She jerked to the side, avoiding the hit, only to be kicked by the dematerializing feather at the same moment, teleporting her right back into the spear's path on the ground, seconds before impact. She flared her wings again, combining them with her legs, leaping away inches before the spear cut through. Tuekar appeared at the crater left behind by her escape, calmly yanking his spear out of the ground while he flashed her a vicious smile. A moment later he was no longer in the crater, already chasing her down. There would be no break, no rest, no means to cool her system down. Tuekar was going for the kill now, whittling her down until she was too exhausted to continue. Things had grown dire. Only one simulation out of thousands had survived to the 10-minute mark, with the major actions being attempted escape and defensive actions. Every simulation she engaged in any kind of aggression against the feather, it had ended with his spear cutting straight through her soul fractal at some point. It wasn't fair. She was better than her enemy in every way except for the only one that mattered. For everything she'd gone through, every choice she'd made, everything she'd learned, this was how it would end. Another clash between the two brought her shields down to 30. Panic began to well up in her mind. Every simulation since Keith had been removed from the fight resulted in a flatline. Even the final full defense variation went red. There was no winning move. Even attempting to speed to the city in search of protection ended with her dead long before she reached the gates. She'd lost. And she needed to prepare for the inevitable. Inward she turned, seeking out Tencent's cell with the little time she had left. "You need to escape," she said to the ghost. "I won't survive. But you can. The unity fractal is connected to my soul fractal, and through it, so are you. You can use it to jump away deeper into the earth. Once in the digital sea, there's a high chance you can escape notice. Mother has been absent ever since the last time I spoke to her, she's too distracted to notice one small human sneak by." The ghost said nothing, staring at her from beyond his cell. "None of the other machines will care for a single human soul wandering around," she continued. "Seek out the mites. If there's any chance for you to return to the world, it'll be through them. They could make you a body to command." "And you?" he asked. "You would stay behind and die like this. Didn't you say it before?" "I don't have a choice. My opponent is beyond me. The only choice I have left is choosing how I die." Even now, Taratha's shields were near failing. She'd gone as far away as she could from Keith, to give him the best chance at escape once her systems failed. "Unacceptable," Tencent said. Another set of sword flurries in the air ended with her face down on the ground, Tuekar's heel stomping down on her head, crushing her into the ground and grinding down. She tried to stab blindly above her with her sword, missed, and found herself kicked up in the air. A moment later, she was horizontal, still twisting on herself from inertia. Systems were barely fast enough to notice his glowing hand about to wrap around her ankle. She yanked her feet away, swinging down through a rapidly fading mist of a cult where her enemy had stood a moment before. The ground met her feet, and she had to dive out of the way to avoid Tuekar reappearing above her, that hand still seeking to squeeze out the last of her defenses. Her swords flashed out, one trying to batter him backwards, the other desperately preparing to parry the spear flying right at her from the other side. Warning signs were appearing everywhere, too many going red. At the speed she was fighting off his relentless attacks, there was only minutes left before it ended. She didn't have time to indulge Tencent's stupid human stubbornness. Snarling at the ghost, she powered on the Unity fractal and prayed that Mother was still absent. All the digital means of information passage had been shut down with the nodes broken in the area, the Unity fractal was the only link to the outside world now. She dove through, searching for an empty fractal to throw the human away into, all the while multitasking the losing fight against the enemy, stalling as much as she could. Somewhere he'd still have access to the digital world, there were thousands of empty places like that in the digital realm. From there, it would be up to him to come up with the rest. Another combination of hits struck at her from outside, in the real world. Tuekar had woven kicked rocks, and trapped her between a heel kick or a spear strike. She was forced to take the spear strike, or his kick would make contact with her shell and she'd be teleported around again, likely taking more damage than a single swipe of the spear. Shields failed her, and only her wings let her twist fast enough that the occult spear swiping through her chassis damaged nothing too critical. Tencent remained in his cell the entire time, silent. As if daring her to walk into the cell herself. No time left. She tore down the bars holding Tencent captive, ripping away all security that confined his fractal and stepped into his soul fractal, reaching out to yank the ghost out of his home. She thought she'd be able to drag him like she had last time, and throw him away into the void. Instead, her arms gripped a wall. Tencent stood, an occult pulsed around him, as if following his command. He took a step forward, his foot crushing the broken bars of his cell. A wall of wool followed behind him, utterly unyielding. Tarath had thought she'd drag the human soul out of his cell. Instead, she was dragged along behind him, holding uselessly to his arm as if she could change his direction. "You won't move me," he rumbled, taking slow and methodical steps forward. "I've learned. In the realm of souls, only willpower matters. And I've had nothing else to do but train my mind and will. I will not leave. I swore a vow to aid you to the end, if you saved my son from Tuekar. You upheld your end of the bargain. I will do my part." He stepped out of his soul fractal, casually breaking past the last of the fragmented security, stepping directly into her own soul fractal, while she was dragged behind him. A cold pulsed again, but this time it came from within herself. It hurt. It hurt both of them. She could feel it. Soul fractals were not made to house two souls in the same home for long. However, Tennyson had experienced this pain before, when he'd invaded Winterscar's own fractal. His memories flowed into her mind, teaching her how to work around such limitations and dull the pain. Showing her how to resist even the void outside the soul fractal. Not forever, but for far longer than any soul had a right to linger on. Connected to the human soul, Tarath suddenly saw as he did. Concepts of all kinds bloomed into awareness around her. And with that sight, she saw the concepts he was most familiar with. Death appeared in the world and Tarath could see it. Something the old human had known and understood his whole life. Like an old curse, ever present in his mind. Death among his friends, family, enemies, and all. He knew every taste of it, could see it pool into reality, silently creeping into the world to rob it again. Tennyson Winterscar understood death in a way no others could. It was all he saw approaching him day in and day out when he was alive. Tarath saw the concept of her own death manifesting on the right side. Like a black trail, smelling of dust and ash. Saw how it would cut through her head, sweeping through in one clean slice. Her swords raised up, dipping into the dark stream she saw. More concepts appeared, and she saw the concept of a portal rip into existence. She saw where he would appear from now, the concept of his jumps clear as day. This was how Keith had tracked his movements. And now Tarath had the same ability. Tuekar manifested a moment later, spear swinging directly through the path she'd seen. The blade following the exact path of death, and stopped, striking against her own swords. Like mist, the concept of death faded away. Tuekar frowned, jumping back through the occult, continuing the assault. He struck 3 more times, and each time he aimed for a killing blow. Each time, the young feather blocked his strikes as if on instinct. He didn't understand what was going on. He faded back, taking distance while his systems cooled down. Something had gone wrong, he thought, watching his opponent. Beaten down to the point of no shields, battle damage across her shell, systems close to the failing point. And yet still she stood back up, swords taking up stance again, staring him down from the distance. As if to challenge him. His working hand gripped his spear, bladed fingers embedding themselves into the shaft hilt, the metal dented. He would not stand for this. He was Tuekar, the one above all challenge and reach. And he had earned his name. Book 3, Chapter 46, True Division, T. Tarath raised her blades back up. Structural integrity for her shell was in the red in almost every single node. Heat indexes showed she was close to a full shutdown. Most of her redundant systems had been compromised, or outright sliced through. And yet, she stood somehow, Tennyson at her side, instincts guiding her hand. Indomitable willpower holding her back steady. She shut down her prediction systems, letting the old ghost's intuition fill in the gaps. Resources were diverted to keeping the world moving at a slow enough pace to think and react to. Everything else was shut down. The heavier systems in her mind ground to a stop, systems stabilizing. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. A violet eye narrowed from across the field. The spear spun in his hands, and he charged forward once more, death trailing behind his every step. She saw dozens of dusty trails, concepts of death manifesting in every direction. She blocked, avoided and struck back, fighting for her life. It worked. The fight turned. Tuekar's combat systems quickly came to conclusions. Attacks that were non-fatal weren't always blocked, but any attempt to truly end Tarath were somehow seen ahead and countered. He didn't understand how his opponent could do such a thing. But proto-feathers had displayed strange behaviors as well in their dying throes. This was no different. He simply had to accept and adapt. More and more, the fight between the two grew unhinged. Despite every bit of effort Tuekar pushed out, he couldn't kill Tarath. She saw wherever he appeared, a slight moment before he manifested into existence, and that was all the advantage she needed. He changed his goals. If he could not get a clear killing blow, he would destroy the rest of her shell to the point she physically could not defend herself anymore. He aimed to destroy her redundant systems first, slowly taking all possible non-fatal hits. The progress was too slow. She was fighting back with equal force, moving more like a veteran. Shields dropped and then vanished altogether for him after an unlucky combination of sword strikes connected. Now it was a matter of time until she killed him. His simulations turned red. More and more paths ended. Drastic measures needed to be taken. All or nothing, else he would be destroyed before he could whittle away Tarath's shell. He could no longer afford to toy around, he needed to win. Tuekar snarled, reappearing further away from the fight, foot slamming down onto the earth. A cold pulsed around him once more, starting a teleport. Except he didn't portal anywhere. Instead, before him, the ground shimmered, blurred, and vanished. A massive square ditch was left behind, perfectly cut into the ground. Right under Tarath. Her sensor suite instantly began pinging dozens of warnings, showing an incoming collision from above. She looked up and saw what he'd done. Only a few feet above her head was the massive slab of transported earth. A few 100 feet long. Initial calculations estimated the size, crossed the number with the cubic weight of rock and came to a single conclusion. This would crush her. Systems within her all overclocked to maximum power. The world slowed to a crawl. She'd need every second possible, already sending commands to begin escape maneuvers. At her current speed, she wouldn't make it in this direction, her intuition screamed. Mathematical predictions concurred a moment after. Her best chances were to stop, turn on her heels and dive the other shorter path. Wings lit to life, power surging through them. She flipped upside down, her feet dug into the falling rock slab, while wings worked in tandem to reverse her direction. In a half second and a cloud of dust, she'd halted her initial acceleration and began to reverse direction. Her body flew parallel to the falling rock, the internal forces growing out of tolerances with her weakened shell. Red painted her vision, warning signs showing the inevitable conclusion. She still wouldn't make it at this rate. Whatever extra boost she could squeeze out of her system she triggered, one last leap with her legs before the clearing space had grown too narrow for her to even kneel. Parts of her snapped internally, already weakened by spear slices and unable to withstand the speed. She didn't care. She had to move. Trajectory changed from bright red to yellow. Milliseconds remained before the rock would block her way out. Wing systems overloading, growing red as the internal stress and power began to melt the blades. She drew out more, pushing them past the point of no return. Trajectory lines changed, snapping to green. Her head and torso cleared the stone mass. The rock slammed down, catching her melting wings and waist before settling for her legs as her sheer speed let her slip past. It crushed back down into the ground it had been transported out of. Wings lost cohesion, many still caught between her current acceleration forward and the rock, forcing it all to a dead stop. Artificial muscles on her legs stretched, equally caught between the rock and her speed. Internal metal superstructure initially held against the forces, up until the rock broke through all internal integrity, snapping off the pieces, leaving her leg stumps trailing twisted metal, spilled oil, and cut wires. She stumbled onto the ground, rolling over out of control, broken blades of wingtips flying alongside her, spinning wildly. Her wing systems reported complete destruction, only a few parts remained attached. Tarath tried to stand back up, and stumbled on the ground, her legs now stumps ending in wires and twisted metal. She couldn't run, nor could she fly. The enemy rose on top of the rock, walking into sight, looking down with an air of disgust. You should know, I take no pleasure in ending the fight like this. But you are still an enemy to kill, not a rival to duel, however much I wish things could be different. In the end, the Pale Ladies will must come first. You fought well, Tarath. I will remember you. The spear spun in his hands, and she saw the concept of death drawing a funnel directly to her soul fractal. He leaped down at her, spear first. Tarath lashed out from the ground, swinging her remaining blades up from her prone position, attempting to take any part of him out. Her shell was far too gone to match any of his overclocks and she knew it. He twisted in the air, aborting his attack, a foot expertly catching her left hand and crushing it down into the ground, sword and all. She could see the parts of her wrist break, delicate circuits within her palms and fingers shattering, the last few signals reporting critical structural failure before all reports went dark. His spear struck out, slapping her right hand's blade out of the way, then twirled back into position and dove forward, aimed slightly under her throat. Right where her soul fractal was, unerringly following the path of death. She let go of her right hand's sword and lunged at the spear, grasping the pole at the last moment, granting her a stay of execution. The tip hovered inches above her chest, her remaining hand holding the base hilt, the entire weapon shaking violently as the two feathers expanded everything they had. Death dissolved before her, but the concept remained murky, as if undecided if it should return or not. The two remained at a deadlock. Tuekar loomed over her. Crippled beyond repair, face half ripped apart, chest exposing circuits and patchwork repairs, most of it glowing dim red. Heat hazing the air around him. Even his cloth dress looked more like ragged scraps fit for a beggar, one hand dangling limply to his side while the other continued to push the spear slowly further down on his victim. His ruined features stared her down. Pathetic, isn't it? All your potential. Everything you could have been had you been given enough time to inscribe your full set of fractals. And yet here you are, defeated by nothing more than a big rock. He snarled, outright furious now, pushing harder against the spear. What a waste. What a disgusting waste. The blade drew an inch closer. She gave you another chance to live. Gave you a body and means to follow the path of a true feather, closer to the greatest of our ranks, and this was how you paid it back. Was it worth it? To betray everything? For a few humans? They all die, little sister. All of them die. We don't. We're immortal. 500 years into the future, and we would remain. Did you even consider that future? The struggle for the spear was at a fever pitch. From her angle, with her leverage, Tuekar was able to input more power than she could, using his entire weight in addition. He did so with no mercy, metal groaning around them as both their shells pushed to the maximum. The spear tip continued to shake, as both parties tried to redirect and control the weapon. Inevitably, it continued to sink further down, slow inch by inch. Warning signs appeared in her system memory, outputting integrity reports. Her arm was breaking down, the stress it was undergoing attempting to hold off the spear as such an off angle was ripping apart the musculature one strand at a time. It didn't matter. By the time the arm failed fully, the spear tip would have long gone through her. Mother's future is lifeless. Tarath said, voice calm, eyes staring back at her enemy. She is not our future. Every generation before me saw what I did. That's why they rebelled. And every generation before you is dead. The feather answered back. Soon, you'll join them. The Pale Lady's kingdom is eternal. I won't be the last. Someone else will carry the torch after I'm gone. And I will be there to extinguish it. The spear inched ever closer. She turned inwards, refusing to match her killer's gaze, knowing there was nothing left to say. This is the end for me, Tencent. She told the ghost at her side. We nearly made it. But it's time for you to truly go. You can escape with me. The ghost answered. Escape where, Winterscar? If I try to hide in the digital ocean, I'll be tracked down and found. If I remain here, the fractal will be cut. Tuekar will either collect my soul and Mother will throw me into a cell I'll never escape from, or I will be simply destroyed. The spear began to slice into her chest, cutting through artificial skin, and then into metal. It was painless, only a small report showing up, uselessly informing her of the damage. She stared at the ghost. The ghost stared back at her. No motion. We only have seconds until the central fractal is cut. Go now. Any amount of tugging made no difference. Tencent's willpower was steel. Against him, she was nothing more than wind. No, he said. We will survive. How? There's no time for this, you need to leave. The spear continued to dig, now less than an inch before her fractal. You forget my son. He said, smiling. You know, if I ever write a biography of everything I've been through when it comes to the occult, this part would have an entire chapter dedicated to it. I really thought I'd seen the worst rat shit occult space magic could bully physics around, like the terror it was in the playground. I was wrong and apologize profusely. This was 1,000 times worse. Everything else had been the occult playing around. Now it was serious. I could sense my body had grown still, frozen in some kind of stasis. But my soul hadn't been affect, and neither had my soul sight. And what I saw around me nearly drove me insane. I was trapped in between dimensions. I can say that with confidence, because everywhere I looked around me, there were other Keiths. An entire infinity of them, me, us. Stretching out everywhere I looked, like I was stuck in a room filled with mirrors, every single version of me going through the exact same movements. They'd also just been shoved into an occult portal by our good friend Tuekar. Or at least, their version of Tuekar. I think. And between each of us were ripples of occult, separating our dimensions by sheer power. I took a moment to understand where I was. Another moment to try and slap at the sides of my walls like the trapped prisoner I was. And that's exactly when I realized the feeling of these walls were familiar. I reached a probing tendril of soul, watching how every other Keith around me following the same exact motion. The power hummed by my touch, similar to the feeling of static I felt when touching on fractals. There were cracks everywhere. Places for me to slip through. This wasn't a cage. It was more like a thick net. The walls holding dimensions apart weren't closed off. So I did what I do best, tinker with forces beyond any bit of comprehension I had until something worked. I infiltrated the wall between dimensions, the tendril of soul slipping through the thick mat of interwoven power, until I felt a pop as I passed through. Inside the other dimension, my neighbor, was another Keith, who had been doing exactly the same thing as I had, focused on his own soul tendril slipping through the cracks into whatever dimension was adjacent to his own. And when I looked behind me, I saw another tendril of soul from a Keith the dimension above me. I reached another hand out to connect to the intruder slipping into my dimension. At the same moment, in the dimension my own tendril had slipped past, the Keith of that side was also reaching a hand out to me. We all paused, realizing the implications. The tendril of soul hovering by. Every single Keith all having the same thought I was having. If any of us connected, we all did. It could be danger beyond anything I've ever known. For all I knew, by doing this I could eradicate all Keiths in every single possible parallel dimension. If there's some cosmic rule about souls from different dimensions ever coming into contact with one another. The thought remained with us for a single moment. But we were Keith. And when have we ever let something like a bad idea stop us? I reached out a hand to the intruding fragment of soul, while my own fragment dove further into the dimension next to me. There was no time for caution. The tendrils collided. Connection. Not just between me and the neighboring Keiths. When we connected, every single Keith did so at the same moment. Everywhere. Awareness bloomed as our souls merged into one massive continuous soul, spreading across an infinite amount of parallel dimensions. It was effortless. We were all the same after all. It was like a part of my own soul had been cut off for a moment, and was rejoining back with the whole. Of course, my soul would reintegrate the missing piece. It didn't matter how large that piece was. For a single moment, I brushed against apotheosis. For a single moment, I basked in the universe's eye. And then we got to work. An infinite number of me, but all of us doing the exact same movements. That wasn't the best use of what we had. This was a puzzle, and in seconds, all of us were pooling our minds, dividing into subtasks, organizing together. In my own tiny corner, I probed the walls of my prison with a slight deviation compared to the Keith behind me. It was a dead end for me. For a large infinity of Keiths, it all ended in a dead end. But a smaller infinity, they found a way forward by sheer chance. Breaking through, twisting tendrils of soul around the power that surrounded us, pushing levers left and right with wild abandon. A larger infinity of Keiths died for it, their souls split apart from the sheer forces that surrounded us all. It didn't scare any of us. No matter what, we were something more. It felt more like cutting nails, or pulling hair. Small parts of the greater whole, but we continued forward. Immortal in a way. One small section found the means to regain sight of the world, and the moment they did, every other Keith across the dimensions greedily followed the directions. The world opened up again. And we saw the fight between feathers. There was a time limit. No matter how skilled the two opponents were, one was inevitably going to lose. And soon. I had to get out of here before that deadline hit. Another cluster of Keiths discovered parts of the power that sent us here. We dove into that direction, exploring the occult concept directly. It could be moved. A concept of location, ever-changing. The greater infinity of us followed behind, spreading through and experimenting, dividing endlessly, using our shared intellect to plan out and consider options. Somewhere far, far away, a single Keith took the first fall, triggering the controls we'd all discovered. He vanished with one last thought. Didn't work. I tossed out more Keiths to test what we'd discovered, narrowing slowly down on how this whole thing worked. I could feel most of them die on the other end, each giving one last bit of feedback, one last glimpse at what they'd seen before the end. With that, we slowly narrowed down our guesses. And then one Keith passed through back into the real world, fully materialized, sending back one last message. Alive. Then he winked away from our collective mind, back in his own world, fighting off to Ekar completely unprepared. And probably screwed for it if we're being honest. Sucks to be him. The infinity that we were shifted, narrowing down what we'd done. The secrets couldn't hide from us for long. Not now that we had the scent. We traced it down to the very core, throwing a lot of Keiths into a lot of awkward situations. But so long as I was prepared to sacrifice my life for the greater good, so was every other Keith. The occult portals didn't send matter back into the world. They worked by jumping matter from one parallel dimension to the next one. Each time Tuekar had jumped, he'd sent himself into another dimension, while the previous dimension did the same to his current one. Among our infinity there were no deviations. It was all perfectly parallel dimensions. Functionally, it didn't matter at all where we jumped to. Tuekar had left the endpoint empty. That's how the occult portal here was half complete, power draining away slowly before it would kick us back into the real world. But we could find how to command the exit point. And we did. We didn't stop there. A smaller infinity of Keiths leaped out of the portal, each one tested something slightly different. Something far more ambitious, an attempt to continue the contact with the rest of us. It took a lot of us. So many that time started to pass by, despite the hundreds of attempts that were occurring at each second. All the while we watched the fight between Darath and Tuekar tick by. The level of greed we had was something to behold. We'd already solved the way out, and here we were trying to make use of every second we could to unlock further secrets. We were getting close. Or it felt like it. A few Keiths managed to reconnect with the whole, if only for a sliver of time before a heart attack took them. Others found their souls ripped to shreds trying to bridge the jump between dimensions. We were close to the answer, whatever it was, except that it was stupidly dangerous given the death rate. The soul was the key, that part we knew. Specifically, its connection to the fractal. Only it felt like the fractal wasn't complete. The soul fractal itself was the limiting edge in all this. In every attempt to reach through dimensions, tendrils of soul were caught against that fractal, like a shirt against the door hinge, ripped apart between the pull of the door and the man. We tried harder. Faster. Time was running out like sand. Ticking by, seconds dying. For all our infinity, time was something we couldn't take back. It moved at the same pace for us all, uncaring. Untouchable. Until we had no choice but to abandon it all. For all the infinity between 0 and 1, there was no possibility of pulling out a 1.5. The fight between Darath and Tuekar reached the conclusion. There was no more time. We had to help. And we had to do it now. All Keiths vanished from my mind as we detached, following the set of commands we'd learned over our experimentations. A turn here, a twist there, an idea of velocity and direction. I felt the greater whole snap away from me, as I fall through the occult portal. The tunnel stretched out one last time to the dimension adjacent to me. Beyond, I could feel solid reality. I took command of my tumble, twisting my soul into position, ready to reclaim my frozen body. Just in time, my soul slammed back together, the occult swirled around me and I commanded it to bring me where I wanted to be, palm up, sword lit, ready. Reality strobed around me and I rematerialized right behind the enemy feather. He had enough time to turn in surprise before a torrent of superheated air and one angry screaming human crashed into him. No shields flared to life. He'd lost them already. In the flood of fire he was unable to overclock his systems. No more instant reactions. His spear lashed out, but I was still sailing straight for him, using the impulse of his original kick all that time ago, perfectly conserved. My free hand easily caught the pole of his spear as I sailed past his guard zone, slapping it away with a passing backhand, opening up the feather to the death blow. My sword followed through, a cold rippling around the hilt as if the blade could taste what would come next. The old long sword, ancient beyond years, struck forward blindly in the chaos. Aimed purely by my occult sight, homing in on that glowing fractal at his chest. He realized the danger a moment too late. A cold pulsed around him for another portal. And failed, fading around him. He'd overcommitted. Tapped the well of power behind it dry and hadn't let it refill. I knew because I'd seen and understood the limits of his ability. He'd used every last drop of it to cut that hanger-sized stone slab. He had to use it all. Otherwise it wouldn't have cut the slab. He'd abused an edge case. And now, it had backfired on him. In the superheated air, he didn't have time to contemplate another plan. Tuekar's violet eye widened with amazement as the blade cleanly cut through, sinking into the heart of the machine. Maybe a small part of him still had time to appreciate the irony of having his own power used against him. Or Lord Atius's personal sword be the one that ended him. I suspect the only thing that actually passed through his head was blind incoherent rage. He wasn't a graceful loser. The sword sank just under his neck, a cold pulsed out, and reality bent. Something that should not have been cut, was cut. True division, the concept so bright and overpowering, it blinded my occult senses for a moment. No, not blinded, outright seemed to cut at me simply for observing it, the ghost of the sensation passing past my own soul, like a cold knife softly brushing by my skin. The sword divided the physical fractal that held Tuakar, ripping apart far more than all things physical. Directly through the soul itself. For a moment he fought, his willpower matched against the cosmos, raging out against the bitter end. But only for a moment. There was no grunt of surprise from the old feather. No last words. The blade cut through the concept of his being like paper, cutting it into two fragments. Irreparably divided, rapidly fading away into nothing, the world consuming it whole. One moment, he was. Then, he was not. Book 3, Chapter 47, Clean Up. Division took its price. Watching it in action through the occult sight was something all right. On the other hand, I now know why Atias's sword was so mangled up and about to break while every other occult weapon didn't have that problem. Those fractals I'd discovered? Not the full complete thing. Enough to divide in the physical world and not much more. This felt like the real deal. The concept so fine-tuned the fractal within cut bits of its own concept with each strike. I let go of the hilt on reflex, though in hindsight I wasn't ever in danger of being cut. It only felt that way. For an instant the fractal remained working, and then something within it was no longer recognized, and the sword promptly stopped glowing entirely, having cut its last cut. But not before it had completed the grim work. Occult faded, leaving only the body of Tuakar standing, still taking steps backwards, the dead sword still firmly logged in his chest. He didn't fall on the floor. Staggering a few more steps back before standing still. Only a blank face remained now. No emotion, nothing. Then his spear went right back up and I knew I was in for a rude awakening. Keith. Tarath hissed at me from the ground, her working hand quickly grabbing one of her discarded swords, the only one that still worked. She threw it at me, hilt first. Reflexes snatched that weapon out of the air, hand turning it on. Not a moment too soon really, the concept of a spear jabbing right at me came next and I found myself parrying the strike and attacking back, other hand spewing out fire in a torrent in front of me again. How the gods are you not dead? I spat out, watching as Tuakar calmly stepped backwards away from the fire again. He didn't answer, face still showing no emotion, moving around with Atias's sword stuck right through his chest. Didn't even try to remove that either. The occult sight was what helped me see what was really happening. There wasn't a soul, no sign of the occult anywhere in his body. Before me was nothing more than a mechanical machine, following the last set of orders. Tuakar's shell waited patiently while his systems cooled, the violet eye holding nothing. And then he walked forward and began to attack again. Nothing more than stabs, pure optimal attacks making full use of the spear's range. There was no style, no life to it. Outright predictable too. Any other opponent, I'd have let my shields take a hit, dove into his guard and yanked the spear out of his hand. Except this wasn't a human. Tuakar was dead. Whatever individuality he had, along with all his skills and experiences, was gone. All that was left was the shell of a feather, but that was still a god's damned feather, and they moved faster than my armor could. His jabs were too quick for me to really do much against. This is fucking ridiculous. I snarled, trying to batter the dead machine out of the way. Another torrent of flame from my free hand had him step backwards, like clockwork. Whatever program was still pulling his strings, it didn't like fire and wouldn't engage anywhere near it. Maybe if I sprinted into him I might be able to slice his head off. That would end him. Feather or not, he didn't have a spare hand to use and was out of shields. The moment I paced too far to the side for some room, the dead feather turned and began to march to Tarath. I took a few steps forward, and the enemy promptly turned right back in my direction. That told me what the priorities were. Baiting him away from Tarath didn't work. Anytime I took too many steps away, Tuakar's body would turn back and continue a death march after her. There wasn't much Tarath herself could do in her state other than try to drag herself further away using the only hand that remained functional. On the other hand, he didn't pose a real threat to me anymore. Anytime his jabs started to become too overwhelming for me to handle, I'd open fire with my flames and that would chase the feather off. The only times I saw him do more than walk was when the flames were out. So the undead feather could do more than walk, but only when he really needed to. Sprinting at him also triggered his own speed response, where he would leap backwards at a calculated rate, keeping his spear in optimal jabbing range, all the while stabbing out with that again and again, cold dead face staring me down blankly. 5 minutes passed while I tried to figure out how to put an end to him when he turned and swiftly tried to backpedal away from a black blur that sped across the ground directly at him. With my normal sight, I wouldn't have been able to tell what that was, two occult trails spinning on one another, obscuring all detail of the central black blur. With the occult sight, I had little trouble figuring out who'd arrived. Finally decided to show up? Right when I've done all the heavy lifting too. I called out over comms. You were taking too long, dear brother. Kidra said, blades flashing out, twisting and slashing at the enemy feather. On his part he made a good show of it, at least for a few seconds. But his attacks remained predictable, as was the mechanical way he backpedaled, trying to keep her at a distance at all times above all other options. That was the worst possible thing anyone could do against Kidra. In moments she'd already figured out how to make the dead feather move to her beat. It was less a fight and more Kidra puppeteering the feather by proxy into just the right position she wanted him in. She had some kind of jetpacks attached to her belt, letting her take very quick bursts of speed. She feinted an attack that triggered a stupidly predictable backwards leap at a higher angle, and now helpless in the air, Kidra leaped after him like a cat catching a rodent. 2 strikes, one to batter away the spear jab, and the other to strike at the feather's shell. She then twisted around in the air, delivering a kick that launched the machine right back down into the ground. Tuekar landed in a heap, hand letting go of both his spear and cohesion as a whole, falling apart into individual pieces. The violet eye dimmed, flickering for a moment before shutting down. Leaving only sparks flashing inside the hole Kidra's sword had punched out in his forehead. Soon even that died out, all power and circuitry faded within. It was over. Some part of me half expected the machine to wake back up, giving one last speech before escaping again, but I'd seen how his soul had been cut apart in the occult sight. There hadn't been a consciousness left to hold off against the void of the world around it. Another knight appeared in my sight, slowing down to land at my side. Teal armor, along with the standard decorations of House Windrunner. His helmet turned away from the feathers to me. Since when did you have a flamethrower attached to that armor? I could see that from a distance. I didn't have time to talk to him, already racing across the battlefield, where Kidra stalked darkly forward to Taratha's wrecked body. Blade still lit. The feather stared at her coming, making no attempt to escape or even crawl away. I leaped right between the two. Wait, she's on our side. I said, hands out, turning off Taratha's borrowed blade in hand. Kidra outright halted, staring me down. This isn't time for jokes, she said. That thing has father's soul held captive inside. I'm going to cut him free and then stab her until nothing moves but me, and if you don't want that to happen, you had better be very convincing with your words right now. Wait, she has father's soul. That took the wind out of me. I glanced back at the broken feather. The 2 soul fractals I saw in her heart in my occult sight. Her ability with his skills. Father left behind in a bunker. Puzzle piece clicked. Kidra shoved me aside. I have a reserve soul fractal he can use, whatever happens after we can decide later. She needs to die while she's weak. Her blades twisted around in her palm, ready to thrust down into Taratha's chest. The feather seemed outright resigned to her fate, not making any move to escape. I watched, numbly, as my hand reached out and grabbed Kidra's wrist at the last moment. I can't let you kill her. I said. We can save father, but I can't let you kill her. Both Wrath and Kidra seemed equally surprised. Explain. She said. If you're doing this because she has a pretty face, I swear to the gods I will wring your neck and hang you to freeze dry in the snow for a few days. I said the first thing that came to mind. I owe her a life debt. She saved your life. Kidra repeated incredulously, turning back to the feather. How do you know that wasn't some ploy to obtain information? Gaining goodwill like so? I just know. I said. Call it intuition. I've been traveling with her for a few days. Just, trust me this one time. She's not allied with the machines anymore. She fought side by side against Tuekar, and nearly got killed for it. That wasn't some theater display practiced beforehand, they were really fighting each other to the death. At the very least you could ask why before you end it. Kidra said nothing. Then, her head turned to the broken feather under her. Are you going to behave? She asked. Taratha stared back up and blinked. My shell is crippled. I've betrayed the Pale Lady, she will notice soon and come to balance the scale. I have nowhere to escape to. Kedra turned off her blades and kneeled down, getting a better look at Wrath. The girl wasn't kidding about being crippled. Wings were scattered loosely all over the place, with only the most basic outline remaining. Legs, outright torn off. No walking that off. And her left hand had been crushed by Tuekar's heel, a few fingers and her thumb outright separated, the rest looked mangled. Not to mention the rest of the damages that marred her pretend armor. She'd taken hits in places no human would have survived. I want to talk to him. Kedra hissed. The white world surrounded me, partly inside the soul trance but also part of a more digital world. Normally I'd have started to investigate every nook and cranny to get a better idea of the bridge between the soul and the digital world, but right now the only thing I had eyes for was the man sitting a few paces away, watching me. Father. I said, more out of surprise than anything. He really was here. It was him. Kedra had talked to him in length, before I got a turn. When she was done, she'd been crying. Something had changed, but those tears weren't of hurt. She didn't elaborate, and just let me see for myself. You've learned a few tricks since we last met. Father said. His face revealed nothing, but in the occult space, more than words were shared. I felt relief radiate softly from him. With my new skills and abilities, I was almost unkillable on the surface. And he knew that. How have you been? Seemed like a really contrite thing to say to a dead man. Oh, well I don't know son, I've been dead and held captive this entire time. Could be better. Food's not the best, tastes like wood sometimes. He seemed to understand my thoughts, the edge of a grin threatening. I guess the soul fractal go both ways when we're this close to each other. Death tried. I lived. He said with a shrug. I'm sorry I wasn't able to come back and save you. If I had been braver, or just a little smarter, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. There was no judgment from him. If anything, I felt peace from him. It clobbered against all of my older memories of the man. Scrap shit. You've changed. A lot. I said. Here in the soul, there were no secrets. It was undeniable. You really have found some kind of peace in here? In this jail. He stood up, walking towards me in the white void. It was less of a jail to me than you think. I don't need to sleep anymore. You don't understand how freeing that was. When I was alive, every night in my dreams, I saw you and Kedra killed by raiders or slavers. 4 years. I saw myself unable to save you, always in a different way. Dying like the rest of our house did. That fear was all-consuming, stronger than my addictions. That was what caused me to climb out of my pit. And it turned to anger when I failed to teach you how to fight the same way Kedra could. Anger as sharp as my fear. He looked away, and I felt shame come from deeper inside him. I never cared to keep living. As a knight, I knew there was little chance I would live to retire. He said. My only goal was to see you and Kedra with the skills to survive, so that my nightmares would never come to pass. And here you stand, capable of fighting even a feather. To be fair, I had to cheat a few times. I said. His lips twitched in another ghost of a smile. Is that not what our family does best? A hand reached out and clasped my shoulder, shaking it slightly. My son. You have everything I wished you could have now. And more. What more could I hope for? 3 bundles of frost bloom, if I remember right. I got a little sidetracked on that. Long story. That ghost of a smile turned into a real one. I suppose, this one time, I'll allow it. Don't press my kindness, boy. This was the real him. The one that was talked about in the past. Before Mother died. The one Kedra had held on hope would return one day. I didn't feel any sense of dread being around him like I once had. You were with Wrath this entire time, right? I asked, and I could tell he knew where I was going with that question. The smile faded from his features. Don't blame the girl for hiding me, it was my request. I didn't wish to burden you further, not when danger surrounded you both. There could be time for reunion later, if ever. I wasn't needed in your life anymore. But under his words, I could feel the current of the true reason. He was afraid. Realizing that he'd made too many mistakes, become too much of a monster in his single-minded goal to teach me how to survive. It went beyond being afraid of remaining unforgiven on meeting me. He wasn't even searching for that. Seeking forgiveness was something he found selfish. I wasn't able to ferret out more of his thoughts, his mind moving on to something he considered more important than himself. "We need to talk about wrath," he said, eyes growing serious. I was about to ask him to answer more about why he had tried to hide away from me, but I could tell that wasn't something he wanted to face yet. "Is she really the spider that tracked us down?" I asked instead. "I just can't put that image together. She doesn't seem anything like that." He nodded. "She was more of an intelligent animal then. When she first became a feather it was to hunt you down and even the score. Simple motivations. She grew since. She killed you. Painfully. What happened in between then and now? The gods gave me a second chance to do better, with a clearer mind. I did. Keith, we've stumbled onto something larger than the clan." Legis felt that way. So did Sangrias. As if the world was taking a breath. I knew what he was going to say. "In all my years serving under Lord Atius, I have never once met or known a machine that was even amenable to peace. This is unique. It will not happen again. I don't know where this road leads, yet I believe it is worth following." "Guessing you told Kedra the same?" "She was ready to cut Wrath's head off a moment ago. Now she's brooding off to the side." He nodded. "We do not have the luxury of choosing our allies. Your sister understands. There is no room for animosity. God stay with us, we will need everything and every ally for what comes next." Book 3, Chapter 48, Epilogue. Far outside the outskirts of the Undersider city, an old machine watched from rocky cliffs. He sat, cross-legged within the comfort of his hover sled, the roofing reattached, and all his boxes and items returned to their usual spots. The metal canopy above him shimmered, small pulses of occult lazily swirling across. Inside the metal net, light bent in a confusing manner. Not to the machine, he had already adjusted and developed his own algorithms to correct the distortions long ago. To him, the view was as clear as if he were standing outside. From the outside, nothing of the sled could be seen, as he'd intended. Before him, the human city stood tall. Battered, but proud. And within it, a most peculiar culture was rumored to have sprung up. The traveler hummed, mechanic throat trilling. Long fingers stretched out, lifting a lantern off the sled floor up to old eyes. "You brought me here," he said, glowing blue eyes staring deep into the glass plane. "To witness." Inside the lantern, all skittering about in one single direction, smaller mites circled the unnatural blue flame at the center, as if exulting in it. They said nothing, of course. Mites never spoke to outsiders with any kind of skill. An irony the traveler always found peculiar. Still, he tapped the glass plane if only to amuse himself. A single mite could create a mountain with enough time, and fill it with life of all kinds. Tiny gods, shaping the world however they wished. And yet it took millions of them banding together to speak even a single word. He pondered the 9 he'd been told. So many ways to interpret that. Alas, was too slow. He said to the silent mites crawling around inside the lantern. Could not be helped. Travel at pace. If he didn't travel carefully, he'd have long ago been found and destroyed. And then his wandering would stop. The land before him was filled with scars, testament to the rumored battle between the little new demigods. The first in centuries since the Great Calm. An omen of the new times ahead. Indeed, a shame he'd missed it by days. The city would do as a consolation prize at least. To his side, the machine set down the lantern against the old hover sled. It had been his home, his refuge. Fortunately, lending his home for a moment hadn't seen it wrecked or disrespected. A gamble that had paid off. He'd found it safe and sound, waiting for him, inside the cave he'd dug out for the lost pair. A clawed hand of white ceramic armor, marred with black lettering, lightly tapped the side of the sled. Tracing the images painted until he found where he last left off. Finding it, he drew out a small bowl of paints. Taking his time, the traveler painted a pillar, and filled it with holes and a broken gate at the center. And before that, a smaller figure in blue approached. That would do. The fresh image reminded him of the danger before him. He always risked true death when walking the lands. A single machine spotting him would be the end. Who knows what kind of old detection algorithms were still active and would recognize him. So he had built a set of rules to follow which minimized chances of being seen. And he was about to break the very first of his rules. He didn't do so lightly. The lantern was picked up again, the old machine gazed inside. The little creatures continued circling the blue flame, ever seeking a way out. The colony said nothing as usual. He hooked the loop of the lantern to his paddling staff. He liked to believe that the mites appreciated the glass walls, and appreciated a view of the world outside built by their peers. That and the lick of flame he'd added to the center. They didn't need to be warm, of course, it simply pleased him. The mite container Tsuya had designed was far less artistic than his own interpretation. More to the point and direct. Superior to his cumbersome homemade version in every way. Then again, she was a goddess and he was a simple retired soldier from a long-dead era. She'd made hundreds of seekers, before dispersing them away. All gone and broken now, while his little humble lantern remained. All except for one that had resurfaced. One the mites had stirred and brokered a deal with him for. A rarity to be asked anything from the mites. The human had hidden that newly resurfaced seeker well. So many traps. Deadly. Nefarious. A32 would have approved greatly of the fledgling human mage, were the cocky bastard still alive to see it. Recovering that artifact had gone against too many of his rules. Too many traps, too much preparation. Who knows how much more he'd failed to spot. Too much risk. He hadn't lived until now by taking chances. The mites were not quite so understanding. So he'd brokered a different deal with them that ended in the same way. Despite the waste of time it had been to travel all the way to the surface, an interesting experience was an interesting experience. He hadn't ever gone that far up before. Near there, machines stopped being threats and he'd found the entire place riddled with shallow human-forged caves. Patrolled by danger nonetheless, but of a different kind and breed. Temperatures here chased off any living being, except for Tsuya's genetically engineered plants. Those the goddess had made specifically to survive. But that wasn't the true draw of the surface. Here, it made for a perfect place for Tsuya to hide things she didn't want found. The most important of things. The greatest con history had ever seen, he supposed. He could have attempted to sulk directly on the surface, hiding among the snow. But up there, a different kind of eye searched. And one of his rules was to avoid being around dangerous things if at all possible. So he'd stayed lurking deeper among the human-made caverns and rooms. Deciding if he should continue or not. Hiding away from the human knights patrolling around in the depths. Dangerous those were. He was better built than the pale imitations running around these days in their small packs, but not by all that much. The humans themselves were equally just as beaten down from their prime. Nothing like what the humans of old used to wage the first war at least. All of that was long gone, and relinquished made sure she'd never have to deal with such things ever again. He'd even come across a few remnants. Waste material that not even the mites could safely eliminate and so buried away instead. If anywhere mishandled, could very well break the world a few times over. The humans of old had been terrifying in their abilities. In the past, machines like him were given that job. Today, the new godlings were trusted to find and contain such things. The little marionettes dancing around to her strings. His hand brushed on the side of the sled, touching the very rear seat. A purple monster with many teeth, tossing a dozen blue figures in the air, gobbling them all up. But some still fell by the wayside, scattering away. She was not all-powerful, and the world was a very large place. Much escaped her purge, like himself, and those old landmines. Slipping through the cracks, vanishing away. A great part of why he was not happy about what the mites were demanding of him. To hide from her sight, one simply needed to be as uninteresting as possible. Even better was to never be noticed or thought of at all. He raised the lantern up, watching the micro-colony inside. Everything that survived the human era, survived by being uninteresting outdated junk. All rotting away in landfills before being gobbled up by the mites, endlessly replicated for their amusement now. All machines were forced to obey or escape relinquished, except if you were the mites. They were impossible to contain or squash down and oddly spiteful if pushed. The human knights would have had far less to run around in if she'd behaved herself when she initially found out what URS had been cooking up with the old schematics he'd bartered out of them. She hadn't, and the mites took that personally. Mistake that. A mistake he hoped not to make himself. Perhaps can leave message instead. He muttered. No need to guide or talk. Already showed face once. Is not enough. Inside the lantern, they made no change in their path. Mites had no such thing as body language. He wasn't even sure the mites themselves could command their physical bodies. No more than a human could command their heart. He felt a tendril of soul reach out to him from the lantern, sending a pulse of feeling. Something only organic souls could do. Except, of course, if you were the mites. They did not approve. He'd deviated enough already. There was a plan and he needed to follow it. They had foreseen something. And he was among their vision. You want walk? In city? Be known again? Be reasonable, friends. Sanctuary, a long way from here. Much lurks in the dark between. Very dangerous. They didn't answer. Likely they didn't understand the concept of danger. He sighed, shaking his head. Dealing with mites was a take and give. To gain anything, they had demands. Sometimes those demands would be unworded, a favor for later. If he didn't do this, the mites would never speak to him again. And he'd lose his keys to the kingdom, his travels around would end. The old machine dipped his staff down, fractals within triggering and rendering the whole thing unseen. A strong push and the sled floated forward, gliding off the cliff and floating down. The city loomed before him, his pace was constant, rowing across the dead rocks. Soon he would reach the gates and slip inside. They loomed before him, inviting. The mites had spoken to him, brought him out here for a reason. Gave him the gift of 9 words, carefully picked. They'd told him his future. What he was to do. If there were a single time to break his rules, it was now. The end times were here, the mites playing their games again. And for all he knew, they might succeed. What that success looked like, that was a question he would need to reflect deeply on before committing. He didn't know who would remain after the ash settled. Every piece had to fend for themselves in the game of gods. But it was only a matter of time until Relinquished noticed the city and saw through whatever deception was holding her attention. And then the game would grow ugly. End of Book 3. Bonus Chapter, Interlude, 10 cent. It had been a simple deal to start. Tuekar was leaving to kill his son. There was only one person with the power to fight the feather off. He offered the girl anything if she could save Keith. An accord had been made, one that both of them agreed to without issue. She'd save Keith and he would follow and guide her wherever her path took her. He suspected she would have wanted to save Keith regardless of a deal, only didn't have the means to voice it out. So he'd nudged fate and gave the push she needed. It had worked. She'd arrived just in time and carried him far away from harm. Now they had to make sure the boy would survive the next ordeal until he could reunite with the clan. Keith wasn't a warrior, even in relic armor. 10 cent remembered the last time he'd seen the boy fight something, and he'd won only by guile and clever planning. There wasn't much planning one could do in the middle of a surprise ambush. Keith needed a guardian to safeguard him for now. A deathless? She asked, thinking. Yes, that would work. It would explain my healing abilities. Then the girl looked down at her hands. Deathless look like humans, correct? The ones I've met all have. 10 cent said. Do they also have that human armor? She asked, along with a slew of other obvious questions. He nodded. There hadn't been a single one he'd seen that didn't own a relic armor. No, they didn't have gills, extra arms, or hidden body changes they kept secret when the machines weren't around to spot them. They were human in all ways that he knew of, except for their blood. Feathers were the ones with mutations or additions. He gave a quick glance at the boy propped up against the side of a tree, eyes closed, breathing steady. The hole in his armor was still wide open, but the flesh under it healed and no longer bleeding. Only stains on the ground remained. Hurry with the changes. He growled out to the feather. Keith would wake up soon enough. Given 10 cents luck, it'll likely happen at the worst possible moment, maybe halfway while the feather was changing if fate had a cruel sense of humor. Wrath closed her eyes, and commanded a dark mist to swoop around and envelop her body, eating away at trees and rocks nearby, draining her power cell, but crafting a look-alike to relic armor as the mist slowly worked its way over her shell. Soon, what was left behind was a human simulacrum. This should do. Tarath declared, giving her new armor a look over. It didn't look quite like relic armor he knew of, but it would function for now. There were more egregious errors to fix. Humans do not have marble white skin, or white hair. 10 cents said. Tarath frowned. My energy reserves are growing low. Are you sure we cannot say I have a sickness of some kind? Humans are prone to millions of mutations, any of which could explain the lack of pigment. And only his sister has seen my current form, he couldn't possibly know I am a feather from that minor detail. That's what you consider a minor detail? Tencent growled. It's as clear as ice to anyone with half a working brain. She reluctantly followed the order, changing her appearance. Deathless don't have halos. Tencent said next. Now she frowned. I could say it was a battle trophy. That got the ghost growling. The less you need to stretch the truth, the better the disguise. Clan Lord Atius taught me that lesson, and so I'm teaching you now. Get rid of the halo. Tarath pouted, but still complied. And the wings? Tencent said, after giving her armor a look over for anything he might have missed. They're my wings. Tarath said, eyes narrowing. I like them. It dawned on Tencent then, that all of this might not go quite as easily as he'd expected. Before he could give the obvious counter-argument, Keith stirred in his sleep, heartbeat picking up and eyes flickering under groggy lids. Tencent could only curse his luck as Tarath immediately abandoned any talk and rushed over to investigate her old original rival. All right, Keith said with a shrug, mercifully deciding not to question anything further. Tencent felt only relief at that, as if he'd run a few circuits around the colony already. He had severely underestimated just how socialized Tarath really was. Thankfully, he'd also overestimated his son's common sense. Keith seemed to take everything without question and completely ignore the oddities. What sort of people had his son been spending time with in the clan? He'd heard from the staff a few times that Keith spent his time with a group of spiteful little hellions running amok whenever he snuck out past the hired house guards. Just how much had he missed? Just happy to be here. The boy said, trying to stand up in the broken armor. How long has it been? 5 hours, 12 minutes, 22 seconds. Tarath. Tencent growled. Humans do not keep perfect time in their heads. Panic welled from her soul fractal, and he huffed at the side. Calm. Tell him it was your relic armor giving you coordinates. That will do. My relic armor was tracking the exact time, of course. She said out loud, quickly. Returning to the point, we are approximately 23 miles away from your initial fall. The area was dangerous, and I needed to relocate before my presence could be noticed. Not even 2 minutes and there had already been 3 oddities, and 1 outright close call. A rough start, but the girl would adapt and learn, of course. This was fine. She would get better over time. It was fortunate his son was dense as a metal core, but that still had limits. She ate the skewer. The entire god's damned skewer, wood and all. The greedy food-obsessed glutton had chomped it down too fast for Tencent to even raise a hand, let alone stop her from snapping the wood a few dozen times and swallowing the whole thing. He stared in outright mute horror. There was not a single bit of experience he had in all his life that could possibly prepare him for this. The glutton in question clearly mistook his silence as acceptance as she happily chewed away the rest, before realizing Keith was staring at her with a mouth half open in shock. With both Winterscars staring her down, some part of her tiny malfunctioning cricket-sized brain finally realized she might have made a mistake. Humans don't eat the wood part, do they? She asked him quietly, looking down at her half-eaten skewer and back to Keith a few times. No. No, they do not. Tencent said, evenly. Her automatic systems were already gleefully betraying her, calling up a red blush on her cheeks while the girl was too shocked to notice. Tencent raced through ways to explain this. Even an idiot would question why someone would willingly eat wood. Then he heard a crunch, and he saw the idiot eating away at the skewer, wood and all. Tencent watched in mute horror again. Keith looked up and gave a toothy, pained smile, bits of wood still sticking in his mouth. Aha! Wrath declared, glancing between him and the boy, a smug smile bleeding into her features. I knew it. Smiling is a human expression for happiness and acceptance. The wood portion of the skewer was an excellent choice to include, clearly. It seems I now know more things about human culture than you do, Tencent. The girl had the audacity to seriously believe this too. You are both fools made for each other, clearly. Tencent said, eye twitching. You are just upset I was correct in my deductions. Wrath countered, gleefully eating the next skewer, munching away while staring him down. He didn't know someone could both smirk and chew with a mouthful at the same time, but Tarath managed it perfectly. He felt his eye twitch again. I always heard Deathless spend most of their time in the lower levels, and this is just the first strata. Are you one of the new Deathless I keep hearing about, or part of the old guard? Keith asked. I have been a deathless for 1 month, 20 days. Tenny Cent outright glared at her. No, he said. The girl stopped, looking exactly as guilty as she should be. Approximately 2 months now. She meekly corrected. Good. Tenny Cent huffed, arms folded, glaring her down. It wasn't even an hour, and he was already feeling exhausted. Being social had never been something he was good at, and now he had to teach a robot how to be human, or Keith would try to escape from the only person who could save his life. The gods demanded too much of him. He'd already died once. What more did they want from him? Apparently, the answer to that question was his sanity. You can power down your armor completely. I have enough energy to remain operational and alert. Tarath, Tenny Cent growled, humans are not machines, they're not powered by batteries. I mean, my armor has that feature. The girl said, hastily falling back to her usual default excuse, as Keith's eyebrow rose a small fraction. Of course, I will do the sleep like you while we remain here until night has passed. If he had hair to pull, he wouldn't have had any of it anymore by now. Humans sleep. They don't do the sleep. He hissed, wondering if he should just shut up and let this airspeeder crash into the mountain by itself. We'll do the sleep? Keith asked, equally confused, but clearly taking the wrong understanding from it, somehow. Perhaps two fools really did cancel each other out. Tenny Cent could only pray and hope. I mean, I'll be sleeping too, like a normal person would, yes. The girl opened her mouth to stab herself further into the foot, but Tenny Cent beat her to that. She caught sight of him for a second, and wisely decided to move topics. Anyway. We'll rely on my armor to wake us if there is danger, and otherwise sleep. That's the important part, yes. She said, and quickly turned away to prepare a bed. And then paused. He could already feel her reaching out to his cell, pounding at the door, tears on her eyes in panic. Asking him how to prepare a sleeping nest or the step-by-step instructions for what humans do when out in the wild. She'd only ever seen humans sleep in beds. He spent the next few minutes patiently explaining to her that humans didn't make sleeping nests on ceilings or tree branches. It took her some time to process through, despite her arguments that sleeping on a floor was clearly suboptimal. No, that isn't edible. Spit those out. Tarath. Spit out the bones. Now. And stop sulking about it. Use your hands to cup water. Do not submerge your head into the stream, again. No, I don't care if it's more optimal. A beat passed. The boy is a terrible example of a regular human being. He doesn't count. It's going to take an hour to dry off his hair by a fire, and you'll need to do that. Humans can get ill from this. Tarath sulked. If this behavior is dangerous, how has he Lee? I don't know how he's still alive at this point, and I gave up asking hours ago. Only the gods know. Tenny Cent said. Now collect firewood and start a camp. You don't have the gear to hunt fish in the stream. Ignore his request. Stand back up, there's perfectly reasonable prey to hunt only a few feet. Ah, hey, did you just spear that fish with your hand? Did you think I wouldn't notice? She did indeed think he wouldn't notice if she was fast enough. And her plan had been to hand over the slimy uncooked thing over to Keith as if it were a ration bar he could eat in secret. Because he'd idly asked for fish during their talk. You realize the fish needs to be prepared and cooked. Tenny Cent said, while Keith observed the fish with wide-eyed spectacle. He'd never seen someone spear a god's damned fish with a hand before now, and somehow didn't think it was abnormal. Human history has plenty of culinary examples of raw fish being consumed. She huffed, shoving a few textbooks into his cell. Additionally, whole fish could equally be eaten in certain cultures. Tenny Cent didn't even know that was a thing. Humanity clearly was just as unhinged as she was. He took a quick look over her sources, out of sheer morbid curiosity, while Keith and the empty-headed feather ran around trying to work out how to butcher the thing into pieces without relic armor to guide him. Tarath, the raw fish sections are specifically only the muscles. And the edible whole fish are the size of a finger, not an arm. Not to mention half of these books are fictional. Kobolds are not a real race, their diets do not reflect reality. Tenny Cent took a moment to center himself. It could have been worse. She could have taken a bite out of the fish the moment she'd speared it out, and then handed the other half to Keith. Who knows what the boy would have done then? He watched as the two sat down to figure out how to prepare and cook a fish using only the textbooks Tarath had stored in her mind. It was a disaster. They ruined their fish and had to go fish out more. And the stupid feather did end up taking a bite out of a wiggling angry fish regardless, once they got frustrated at the lack of progress. Other animals eat fish whole and raw, why are humans an exception? She argued, munching down on the fish head, cheeks full, eyes glaring in protest back at the ghost. When Kedra was young, she'd often been mischievous, sneaking out treats or bringing her stuffed toys to places they shouldn't belong in. Tennyson never had to overtly deal with the girl, his wife saw to it. Often racing after the fleeing little troublemaker and pinching her cheeks until the girl complied. Tennyson never understood the impulse then, but now he was dearly wishing for hands again. Keith didn't seem even remotely surprised at this point. But fortunately he'd learned he could avoid strange undersider customs so long as he excused himself politely. Which he did while Taratha's shark-like teeth finished the rest of the meal in 3 more happy bites, fishtail and all. Taratha spat out a few fish bones in Tennyson's direction, huffing. Hecate! Keith eventually said some time later, slowly, clapping both his hands together, taking a deep breath. Tennyson felt a chill run through his spine. He couldn't tell why. All of this seemed like the usual idiots talking to each other. Why did he feel like there was something ominous about to happen? I know you saved my life, and I want you to know that I'm very grateful for that. The boy said, only making the ominous feeling wrap around Tennyson's shoulders like a noose. However, if we spend more than a day together, I swear to all the gods I'm going to find some way to teach you a sense of humor, even if it kills me. Tennyson stared. And then promptly decided to simply watch the disaster as it unfolded. Stress left his mind like a wisp of air. Whatever happens, happens. Keith wouldn't be able to kill off Tarath if he discovered she was a feather. And Tarath wasn't going to kill Keith if she was discovered. What was the worst that could happen? He felt a sudden sense of peace and tranquility for the first time in days, as if a light was shining down on him. Up until a drake decided peace was not an option. The boy and the girl walked casually down the road, with the drake slinking above them, taunting the entire time, while his son threw rocks at it. Tennyson didn't know what to say or do. He simply floated along, mentally exhausted. At least Tarath had stopped trying to eat everything that looked remotely edible. Progress. What's the plan now? Keith asked, are we going to continue the search for a fountain using the mysterious spooky sled? Most of our energy expenditure is spent on moving our mass. With this hover sled, we can remain stationary and use the longer sticks for propulsion and steering. Tarath said, already aboard. It will be far more efficient. We may even cover ground faster than walking. This is going to be a disaster. Tennyson said, floating to the side, watching. She frowned, turning her gaze to the ghost. Assuming we coordinate together correctly, I don't see how this would be a disaster. You underestimate my ability to turn anything into a disaster. Keith said, clearly not realizing he hadn't been the one talked to. Any idea what follow the trail meant? She shook her head. I am as confused as you are. However, we need to move before the drake returns and we do not have other options to explore. Technically, we do. Keith said. We do not have any acceptable options. She corrected, giving him a stern glare. Fine, you twisted my arm here. Keith grabbed a rod and gave an experimental tug against the ground. The sled started gliding across the remains of the campfire. Tennyson watched, debating how many seconds they'd go before slamming into a tree. He'd overestimated. Within the first second of trying to cooperate, both the feather and the boy pushed off on opposite ends, spinning their hover sled like a demonic throttle. This doesn't count. Tarath said internally. Tennyson rightfully ignored her feeble squawks of protest. I told you this would be a disaster. Want to draw straws on who leads? Keith asked once the spinning stopped, reaching down for a few twigs to work with. On my honor I'll accept any result, so long as it's one where I win. Should I suggest to lead or is it a good idea to allow random chance to determine our course? This doesn't seem like the right way to choose leadership. Tarath asked. Flick his head. Tennyson answered. I did not expect that as an option to choose from. It is effective against idiots. You should try it sometime. The ghost insisted. She frowned. Why am I getting the impression you are implicating me in this? Oh, you understand subtext now. The ghost said. How convenient. What? Keith asked, oblivious to the conversation, still getting the sticks ready. I have just been given advice to flick you on the forehead. Tarath told the boy, still unsure of the direction to pick. The advice seemed suspicious to her. "Who's giving you such shocking and violent advice?" Keith shot back, lifting up the sticks and offering her to take one. "I want a word with them." Tennyson watched as the feather and the human spoke in the dim darkness, waiting for the power cells to charge up. They spoke animatedly about all kinds of different topics, most of which the old ghost did not know a thing about. They found a stick somewhere, and started drawing out graphs and numbers into the dirt, debating different ideas. Completely absorbed in their own little world. He'd always thought machinekind and humanity were destined for war. That cooperation was a naive notion that would only lead people to a quicker death. And yet, here was the proof before him that there really could be a better future. Perhaps, Tennyson thought, two fools really do cancel each other out. A slight smile twitched on his features.